Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I was 16 years old, volunteering at a day camp out near the Malala River in Oregon. It was the middle of summer, and the heat was sticky and thick, the kind that makes your clothes cling to your skin even in the shade. I'd signed up for this because my mum thought it would look good on college applications, and honestly, I didn't mind it most days. The kids were loud and exhausting, but being out in the woods beat sitting at home. That particular day, though, everything changed. It was a Tuesday, I think, because we had arts and crafts in the morning, and by lunchtime, me and my friend, we'd been buddies since freshman year, decided we needed a break from the chaos. The camp was set up in a clearing surrounded by tall pines and firs, with the river bubbling nearby. We'd heard about this swampy creek area from one of the other counselors. It was supposed to be quiet, a little off the beaten path. So we packed our lunches. I had a peanut butter sandwich and an apple. He had some kind of granola bar, and started walking. The trail was narrow and muddy from recent rains, with ferns brushing against our legs. The air smelled damp and earthy, like rotting leaves and wet bark. I remember the mosquitoes buzzing around our faces, and we kept swatting them away, joking about how we should have brought bug spray. It took us about 10 minutes to get there, and when we did, the creek was exactly as described. Slow-moving brownish water with lily pads floating on top, surrounded by cedar trees and thick underbrush. The ground was soft and spongy, and our shoes sank in a little with each step. We found a dryish spot near a big fallen log and sat down. The sun filtered through the trees in patches, but it was mostly shady and cool. For a while we just ate in silence, listening to the sounds of the woods. Birds chirping, the occasional splash from the creek, the rustle of leaves. It felt peaceful, a world away from the camp's noise. Then my friend realized he'd left his water bottle back at the picnic table near the camp's main area. He stood up, dusting off his shorts. "I'll be quick," he said. "Just gonna run back and grab it. Don't eat my granola bar." I laughed and told him I wouldn't, and he headed off, his footsteps fading into the distance. That's when I was alone. I checked my watch. It was just after noon. I figured he'd be gone for maybe 5-10 minutes tops, so I settled back against the log, finishing my sandwich and just enjoying the quiet. The first few minutes were uneventful. I tossed my apple core into the bushes, thinking some animal might eat it later. I watched a dragonfly skimming over the water, its wings glinting in the light. But then slowly the woods got quieter, the birds stopped singing, and the usual background noises seemed to drop away. It was like someone had turned down the volume on everything. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe a predator was nearby, like a hawk or something, but then I heard a sound that made the hair on my arms stand up. It was a low, guttural grunt, followed by a series of heavy, shuffling steps. Not like a deer or a bear. I'd heard those before. This was deeper, more deliberate. It came from behind me, off to the left where the cedars were thickest. My heart started pounding right away, a dull thud in my chest that made it hard to breathe. I sat up straight, my ears straining to pick up any more sounds. For a second, everything was silent again, and I thought maybe I'd imagined it. But then there was another rustle, closer this time, like something big was moving through the underbrush. I stood up slowly, my legs feeling wobbly. I didn't want to make any sudden movements. My eyes scanned the trees, and that's when I saw it. Behind a massive cedar tree, about 50 feet away, was this huge, dark shape. At first, my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. It was just a blur of movement. But then it shifted, and I realized it was a creature. It was towering, easily 8 feet tall, covered in long, matted hair that looked almost black in the shadows. Its arms were thick and hung down past its knees, and its body was broad and muscular, I couldn't see its face clearly at first because it was half hidden by the tree, but then it turned slightly and we locked eyes. That moment is burned into my memory. Its eyes were dark and deep set, and they held this expression of pure shock, like it was just as surprised to see me as I was to see it. My own fear was so intense that I felt frozen, my feet rooted to the spot. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and rapid, and my hands were trembling. The creature didn't move for what felt like an eternity, maybe 2 or 3 seconds in reality, but then it stepped sideways, away from the tree. Its movement was fluid but heavy, and as it moved, the ground seemed to vibrate under my feet. Then it crashed away through the underbrush. The sound was deafening, snapping branches, crushing leaves, and these deep thudding footsteps that shook the earth. I could feel the vibrations through the soles of my shoes like mini earthquakes. It moved fast, disappearing into the trees within seconds, but the sounds of its retreat echoed for what felt like forever. I stood there listening, my heart hammering against my ribs. I counted in my head, 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, and it took about 10 seconds for the noises to fade completely. The woods went dead silent again, like nothing had happened. That's when the adrenaline hit me full force. I didn't think, I just ran. I bolted back toward the camp, my legs pumping as fast as they could. The path seemed longer now, every root and rock trying to trip me up. Branches whipped against my face and arms, but I didn't care. All I could think about was getting away from there. My lungs burned, and I could taste blood in my mouth from breathing too hard. I didn't look back, not once. I just kept running, my mind replaying those few seconds over and over. The eyes, the shock, the sheer size of that thing. When I burst into the camp clearing, I was gasping for air, my shirt soaked with sweat. My friend was standing near the picnic tables, holding his water bottle and looking confused. He saw me and his eyes widened. "Dude, what happened? You look like you saw a ghost." I tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come out. My throat was tight, and I just shook my head, panting. I pointed back toward the creek, but my hand was shaking so badly I could barely keep it steady. He came over and put a hand on my shoulder, asking if I was okay, but I couldn't form a coherent sentence. All I could manage was a choked, something big, before I had to bend over, hands on my knees, trying to catch my breath. The rest of the day is a blur. I must have gone through the motions, helping with the kids, cleaning up. But my mind was elsewhere. Every sound made me jump, and I kept glancing toward the woods, half expecting to see that thing again. When we finally packed up to leave, I couldn't wait to get in the car and drive away. I didn't tell anyone else what happened, not even my parents, because I knew they wouldn't believe me. How could I explain something like that? It sounded crazy even to me. But I know what I saw. It wasn't a bear. Bears don't stand that tall or have that kind of presence. It wasn't a person in a costume, because no one could move that fast or make the ground shake like that. It was something else, something primal and real. That day left me forever changed. I can't go into those woods now without feeling a knot of fear in my stomach, and every time I hear a strange noise, my heart starts racing. It reinforced this belief in me that there are things out there we don't understand, like Sasquatch, and that maybe some stories are more than just stories. I'll never forget those eyes, that shock, or the way the earth trembled as it fled. It's a part of me now, a memory that still gives me chills years later. Story 2. All right. I'll write it exactly like it happened to me. It's been years, and I still get a tightness in my chest thinking about it. I don't expect everyone to believe me, but I know what I heard, and I know what we found when the sun came up. It was the summer of 2019. I was staying at my buddy's place way out in Colton, Oregon. His house was one of those older homes, set back from the main road, surrounded by this dense, dark wall of trees on 3 sides. You know the type. It feels peaceful during the day, but at night, the silence out there has a weight to it. It's not a quiet, empty silence. It's a silence that feels full, like something is holding its breath. That particular night, we'd stayed up late just hanging out, playing video games, the usual stuff. Everyone else had crashed around 11. My friend was asleep in his room, his brother was on the couch, and I was in the guest room. I've always been a bit of a night owl, so I was just lying in bed, scrolling on my phone, not really tired. It must have been sometime after midnight, maybe 1 in the morning. The house was dead quiet, and that's when I first heard it. It wasn't a loud sound at first. It was distant, coming from the tree line, maybe a couple 100 yards from the back porch. It sounded like a bird, but wrong. You know how you hear an owl or a whippoorwill? This was like that, but deeper, throatier. It wasn't a clean hoot or a whistle. It was a guttural rolling sound, like something was trying to mimic a bird call, but didn't have the right parts. It was a whoop, whoop, whoop sound, low and resonant. I sat up in bed, phone down, just listening. My first thought was, weird bird. But then I heard another one answer from the left, a slightly different call, more of a chattering kek, ek, 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 but just as deep. Then a third one from the right, a long, drawn-out moan that ended in a series of clicks. That's when the first chill went down my back. They were triangulating us. The sounds were coming from 3 distinct points in the woods, forming a rough triangle with the house right in the middle of it. It wasn't random, it felt coordinated. I sat there for what felt like 10 minutes, just listening, my heart starting to thump a little harder against my ribs. The calls kept going, 5 distinct types, the first deep whoop whoop, the chattering kek, the long moan click, a higher-pitched screech that sounded like metal scraping, and a low, rumbling growl that I felt more than heard. They'd do one, then another would answer from a different direction. It was a conversation. There was no other word for it. This wasn't fear yet, not really. It was more a deep, unsettled curiosity mixed with a growing sense of dread. It was the wrongness of it. You grow up hearing the sounds of the forest. You know what a coyote sounds like, a bear, a bobcat. This was none of those things. This was something that knew the sounds but wasn't part of them. I couldn't take it alone anymore. I had to know if I was going crazy. I got out of bed, the floorboards cold under my feet, and crept out into the living room. My friend's brother was still crashed on the couch, dead to the world. I shook his shoulder, not too hard. "Hey," I whispered. "Hey, you gotta hear this." He grumbled, half asleep. "Hear what, man? Go to bed. Just listen for a second." He sat up, rubbing his face, annoyed. And then he heard it. The low whoop, whoop, whoop from directly behind the house. His expression changed instantly. The sleepiness vanished, replaced by a sharp alertness. He looked at me, his eyes wide. "What the hell is that?" "I don't know. It's been going on for a while." We both just stood there in the dark living room listening. The calls continued, shifting between the 5 types, moving around the property. After a couple of minutes, he nodded towards the hallway. "We should get my brother." We went and woke up my friend. He was harder to rouse, but the second he was conscious and heard the sounds, he was right there with us. All 3 of us stood in the middle of the living room, a little huddle in our pajamas, just listening to this symphony of the unnatural coming from the woods. "It sounds like birds," my friend said, but he didn't sound convinced. "No, it doesn't," his brother countered, his voice low and tense. "Listen to the bass in that. No bird sounds like that." We all agreed. It was unnatural. It was intelligent. The way they took turns, the way they moved around us, it felt like we were being surveyed, studied. That's when the real fear started to set in. It was a cold knot in my stomach, the kind of fear that makes the hair on your arms and the back of your neck stand up. We were all feeling it. You could see it in our faces, in the way we stood, shoulders hunched, like we were trying to make ourselves smaller targets. "We should get a light," my friend whispered. He went and got this big, heavy-duty LED flashlight from a closet. It was the kind that could throw a beam what felt like a mile. We crept to the back door. a sliding glass thing that led onto a wooden deck. The sounds were louder out here. The night air was cool and damp, and the sound seemed to carry through it, wrapping around the house. My friend's hand was shaking a little as he unlocked the door. He slid it open just enough for us to step out. The deck felt exposed. The woods felt incredibly close. The calls were all around us now. Wup, wup, wup from the front left. Kek, kek, kek from the right. That low, rumbling growl from directly behind the house. It was overwhelming. "Okay," my friend said, his voice barely a breath. "On 3. He raised the flashlight. We all braced ourselves, though for what, I don't know. 1, 2, 3. He clicked it on. The beam was blindingly bright, cutting a stark white path through the absolute blackness, illuminating the first line of trees, the ferns, the fallen logs, and the second the light hit the trees, the sound stopped, not faded, not trailed off, stopped, like someone had flipped a switch. One moment the night was filled with this bizarre, terrifying chorus. The next, there was nothing, just the faint rustle of leaves in a light breeze. The silence was heavier and more terrifying than the noises had been. It was a dead, watchful silence. It was the silence of something that knew we were there, something that was now waiting and watching us back. We stood there on the deck, frozen. Nobody spoke. We just stared into that beam of light, scanning the tree line, looking for anything. A pair of eyes, movement. There was nothing, just still, dark trees. The silence stretched on. A minute, maybe 2. It felt like an hour. The only sound was our own ragged breathing. My heart was hammering so hard, I was sure the thing in the woods could hear it. My friend's brother finally broke the silence, his voice a dry croak. "Turn it off." My friend clicked the flashlight off. The darkness rushed back in, thicker and blacker than before. We stood there, blind, listening. For a long moment there was nothing, just that oppressive, waiting silence. Then, from way off to the left, so quiet it was almost inaudible, came a single, questioning, "Whup." My blood ran cold. A few seconds later, from the right, a soft, chattering kek-ek answered. Then, slowly, tentatively, the calls started up again. Not as loud or as confident as before, but they were back. It was like they had been startled by the light, had gone to ground, and were now carefully re-establishing their perimeter. They were testing us. That was the moment the terror truly solidified. This wasn't some random animal. This was something that understood cause and effect. Light on, sounds stop. Light off, sounds resume. It was hiding from us. We went back inside after that. We locked the sliding door and pulled the curtain shut, but we didn't go back to bed. How could we? We sat in the living room, lights off, just listening as the calls continued. They went on all night, for hours. The same 5 calls, moving around the house, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away. We didn't talk much. What was there to say? We were all thinking the same thing, but none of us wanted to be the first to say it. We just sat there, wrapped in blankets, jumping at every creak of the house, listening to that unseen conversation happening just outside our walls. The sounds finally began to taper off as the first hints of grey started to lighten the sky. They didn't stop all at once. They just got fewer and farther between, until about 20 minutes before the sun actually came up, they stopped completely. The forest returned to its normal morning sounds. Birds started chirping, real birds. The relief was physical. It felt like a weight had been lifted off my chest. We finally looked at each other, our faces pale and exhausted in the dim morning light. "We have to go look," my friend said. None of us wanted to. Every fiber of my being was screaming to get in my car and drive away and never come back, but we had to know, we had to see. We waited until it was fully light, the sun properly up over the trees. We armed ourselves with a baseball bat and the big flashlight. Though it felt stupid and useless in the daylight, We stepped out onto the deck again. The world looked normal, peaceful, dew on the grass, birds flitting through the trees. We walked towards the tree line, to the area where the deepest, rumbling calls had seemed to originate, near a small stream that ran along the back of the property. The grass was tall and wet, soaking our pants legs. That's when we saw them. Tracks. They weren't like any animal tracks I'd ever seen. They were impressions in the tall, dewy grass, not in mud, so they weren't perfectly defined. But you could clearly see where something very, very heavy had stepped. They weren't paw prints. They were more like flattened, oval-shaped depressions, and the spacing. I knelt down. I'm 6 feet tall. I stretched my leg out as far as I could, trying to step from one depression to the next. I couldn't do it, not even close. My friend tried. He couldn't either. We paced it out. The distance between each step was 4 feet. A 4-foot stride, just walking. We followed the trail. It came out of the thicker woods, crossed the grassy area in a straight, purposeful line, and went right up to the stream bank. The brush right at the edge of the water was all messed up. Not broken, but bent and trampled, like something big had been standing there for a long time, shifting its weight, looking at the house. We didn't say a word. We just looked at the tracks, at the disturbed brush, and then back at each other. The silence between us said everything. The fear from the night came rushing back, cold and fresh. We heard a crack from deeper in the woods, a branch snapping, and we all nearly jumped out of our skins. We didn't wait to see more. We turned around and practically ran back to the house. I left later that day. I made up some excuse about having to get back early. I couldn't stay there another night. My friend still lives out there. A few months after I left, he called me. His voice was tight. He said he'd been hearing things again, similar calls, though not as many, and crashing sounds like something big moving through the trees, getting closer to the house. He said the logging operations had started up again a few ridges over. I think that's what did it. I think the logging pushed something out of its territory. Something that was hidden. Something intelligent. I've never gone back. That one night was enough. I still have dreams about it sometimes. I'll be lying in bed and I'll hear that low, questioning whoop just outside my window. I'll wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding, and it takes me a minute to remember I'm in the city, surrounded by concrete and traffic noise. But out there, in the deep woods of Colton, the silence still has a weight to it. And I know what's listening from the trees. Story 3. Okay, so I've been sitting on this for a while, but I need to get it out because it's been eating at me. I don't really know where to start, but I guess I'll just dive in. This happened a few months ago on a Tuesday morning. I had a doctor's appointment in town, which is about a 45-minute drive from where I live, out near the Mackenzie River area in Oregon. It's mostly rural out here, lots of forests and farmland, and I've driven this route 100 times without ever thinking twice about it. But that day, something changed everything. I remember waking up feeling kinda off, nothing major, just one of those mornings where you're a bit groggy and not really looking forward to the day. My appointment was for 10 in the morning, so I left the house around 9:15 to give myself plenty of time. The sky was overcast, not raining, but that dull grey that makes everything look a little muted. I got in my truck, an old Ford that's seen better days, and started down the winding road that cuts through the valley. The air was cool, and I had the window cracked open just enough to let in some fresh air, the kind that smells like pine and damp earth. As I drove, I passed the usual spots. The Johnson farm with their sheep, the old logging road that's mostly overgrown now, and then this big cow pasture that stretches out for what feels like miles. It's owned by this guy who keeps to himself. I've never actually met him, just seen him from a distance sometimes. The pasture is mostly flat, with short grass that's been grazed down by the cattle, and it's bordered by dense woods on one side. That morning the cows were scattered around, some lying down, others chewing lazily. Everything looked normal, peaceful even. I was just cruising along, half listening to the radio, not really paying attention to much beyond the road ahead. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something in the pasture. At first, I thought it was just another cow or maybe a deer that had wandered out of the woods. But as I got closer, maybe 100 yards away, I realized it wasn't moving, like, at all. I slowed down a bit, not sure why, but my gut was already starting to tighten. The object was standing in the middle of the field away from the cows, and it was dark, almost black against the green grass. From that distance, it looked like a burned tree stump or something, but that didn't make sense, because there aren't any trees in that part of the pasture. It's all open space. I kept driving, but now I was staring at it, trying to figure out what it was. My mind was racing through possibilities, a weird rock, a pile of dirt, but it was too uniform, too upright. As I got within maybe 50 yards, I could see it more clearly, and that's when the first wave of confusion hit me. It was tall, maybe 5.5 feet high, and covered in what looked like long, dark hair. Not fur like an animal's, but more like thick, matted strands hanging down, almost like it was dripping off it. The shape was wrong, too. It wasn't bulky like a bear or slender like a person. It was just there, standing perfectly still. My heart started beating faster, and I felt this cold sweat break out on my forehead. I remember gripping the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles turning white. I slowed the truck to almost a crawl, just staring at it. The creature, because that's what it was, I was sure of it now, was facing away from me, toward the woods. Its arms hung down at its sides, but they seemed too long, out of proportion with its body. The hair was so dark it almost absorbed the light, making it look like a shadow that had taken shape, and it wasn't moving. Not a twitch, not a shift in weight, nothing. It was like a statue, but one that felt alive in a way I can't explain. I think that's when the fear really started to sink in. My mouth went dry, and I could feel my breath coming in shallow little puffs. I've lived in Oregon my whole life, spent plenty of time in the woods, and I've seen all sorts of wildlife, bears, cougars, elk. But this was different. This wasn't any animal I'd ever seen or heard of. It was too humanoid, but not human. The size was unsettling. 5.5 feet is tall, but it wasn't lanky like a person. It was solid, like it had mass, but it stood so still it was almost unnatural. I kept driving, but now I was parallel to it, maybe 30 yards away. The window was still open, and I could hear the wind rustling through the grass, the distant lowing of the cows, but from the creature there was nothing. No sound, no movement. I remember thinking, is it even breathing? But I couldn't see any rise and fall, no indication that it was alive. Its head was slightly tilted, like it was listening to something, but it wasn't looking at me. That should have been a relief, but it wasn't. Because if it wasn't looking at me, what was it focused on? The woods. Something else. My mind was screaming at me to just drive away, but I couldn't look away. I felt frozen, like if I moved too suddenly, it might notice me. The truck was still moving slowly, and I was afraid to speed up in case the noise drew attention. I remember the sun broke through the clouds for a second, and the light hit the creature, and that's when I saw the texture of the hair. It wasn't smooth, it was clumped and dirty, like it had been caked with mud or something. And the color, it wasn't just black, but a deep ashy gray, almost like it had been charred. Hence why I thought it was a burned stump at first. But then, as I was almost past it, something happened that made my blood run cold. I saw its hand, or what I assumed was a hand. It was hanging down, and the fingers were long and thick, almost like claws, but not sharp. They were just there, dangling. And for a split second, I thought I saw them twitch. Just a tiny movement like a flex. But I couldn't be sure because I was moving and it was so still otherwise. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, and I had this irrational fear that it could hear it. I finally forced myself to look away and focus on the road. I sped up, my hands shaking on the wheel. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and the creature was still there, unchanged, standing in the same spot. It didn't turn, didn't move, just stood there like it had been planted. The pasture stretched out behind me, and I could see the cows still grazing, completely unaware. That made it worse somehow. Why weren't they reacting? If it was a predator, they'd be spooked, right? But they were just going about their business, like it wasn't even there. I drove the rest of the way to the doctor's office in a daze. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. Was it a person in a costume? But who would stand motionless in a cow pasture for no reason? And the proportions were all wrong. Too bulky, too hairy, a bear. But bears don't stand upright like that for long, and they're not that tall or still. I kept going over it in my head, but nothing fit. The appointment itself was a blur. I don't even remember what the doctor said. All I could think about was that thing in the field. On the drive back, I decided to stop by the farm. The owner's place is just off the main road, a little house with a rusty mailbox out front. I pulled into the driveway, my heart still thumping. I didn't know what I was going to say, but I had to ask. I knocked on the door, and after a minute, this older guy answered. He looked tired, like he'd been working all day, and he had a skeptical expression on his face. I tried to keep my voice steady as I explained what I'd seen. I told him about the creature, how it was standing in his pasture, how it didn't move, how it scared the hell out of me. He listened, but his eyes kind of glazed over, like he'd heard this before or thought I was crazy. When I finished, he just shrugged and said, "Probably just a shadow or something. We get all kinds of weird stuff out here, but it's usually nothing." He didn't even seem curious. He mentioned that sometimes people see things in the woods, but he brushed it off like it was no big deal. I asked if he'd ever seen anything like it, and he shook his head. "Nah, just cows and the occasional coyote." Then he kind of smiled like I was wasting his time and said, "Don't worry about it. It's probably your mind playing tricks on you." That dismissal hit me harder than I expected. I felt this knot in my stomach, like I was alone in this. I thanked him and left, feeling even more uneasy than before. Driving home, I kept replaying the encounter in my head, the way it stood there, so still, so out of place. The dark hair, the disproportionate limbs, the fact that it didn't move, not even when I was right there. I started thinking about the stories I'd heard growing up, whispers about Bigfoot or other creatures in these parts. I never believed in that stuff. I'm a practical person, but now I don't know. It felt too real, too vivid to just be my imagination. When I got home, I sat in my truck for a few minutes, just staring at nothing. My hands were still shaky, and I had this cold dread sitting in my chest. I went inside and tried to distract myself, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw it standing there. That night, I barely slept. Every little noise outside made me jump, and I kept expecting to see something in the darkness. The next few days, I drove past that pasture again, but I never saw it. The field was empty, just grass and cows. Part of me was relieved, but another part was even more scared because it was gone. Where did it go? Was it still out there, in the woods? The Mackenzie River area is wild, with thick forests that go on for miles, and who knows what's hiding in there. I've always loved the wilderness, but now it feels different. Like there's something watching, something I can't explain. Even now, months later, I get chills thinking about it. I've told a couple of friends, but they just laugh it off or say, "I must have seen a bear." But I know what I saw. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a person. It was something else, something that doesn't fit into any box I know. And the fact that the farm owner dismissed it so easily just adds to the unease. It's like this secret I'm carrying, this weight that won't go away. Sometimes when I'm out driving at dusk, I catch myself scanning the fields, half expecting to see it again. But I never do, and that's almost worse because it leaves everything open, unanswered. I don't know what it was, why it was there, or if it's still around. All I know is that on that Tuesday morning, I saw something in that pasture that changed how I see the world, and I can't shake the feeling that I'm not alone in knowing it's out there. Story 4. It was one of those ideas that sounds better when you're talking about it over a beer than when you're actually doing it. Back in 2018, a buddy of mine who's always been into this stuff managed to get us invited on this expedition. It wasn't some TV show crew, just a small group put together by a guy who had connections with the Omaha tribe up in Nebraska. The plan was to spend a day looking into these long-standing reports of Sasquatch activity northeast of Macy, right along the Missouri River bluffs. I'm not some hardcore believer, but I'm not a total skeptic either. I've always thought, with all the wilderness out there, who are we to say what's hiding in it? So I said yes. I packed my bag, drove out, and met up with the group. There were 5 of us, total. Me, my buddy, the guy leading it, a quiet, serious guy who'd been out there before, and 2 other guys I didn't know. One was a big, burly fellow who didn't talk much, and the other was a younger, twitchy guy who seemed just as nervous as I felt once we got going. The morning we headed out was cool and damp. It was late fall, and the air had that wet, decaying leaf smell that sticks in the back of your throat. We parked off a gravel road that was more mud than gravel by that point, and we started hiking in. The plan was to investigate a specific thing, something the tribal members had talked about, an X structure. I didn't really know what that meant, and honestly, I was more focused on not slipping in the mud than on any Bigfoot lore. The trail was a mess. It wasn't a maintained path, just a sort of indentation in the earth that was thick, slick mud. It clung to our boots in heavy clumps, making every step an effort. You'd lift your foot, and it felt like the ground itself was trying to suck your shoe right off. The woods on either side were dense, not like a park, but thick, tangled, a wall of bare branches and stubborn brown oak leaves that hadn't fallen yet. You couldn't see more than 20, 30 feet in before it just turned into a shadowy mess. We'd been walking for maybe an hour, single file, not talking much. The only sounds were our own breathing, the squelch of our boots in the mud, and the occasional call of a crow way off in the distance. It was the kind of quiet that feels heavy, you know? Not peaceful, but watchful. That's when I first heard it. It was off to our right, deep in that thicket. It wasn't a branch snap. It was different. It was a sound of something moving, something big, but it was fluid. It was the sound of something brushing against a lot of leaves and branches at once, a kind of rustling swish that was too coordinated to be a deer. A deer is jumpy, all stops and starts. This was a steady, purposeful movement. I stopped dead. My heart, which had been just ticking along, suddenly started hammering against my ribs. I held up a hand, and the guy behind me, the twitchy one, bumped into my backpack. "What?" he whispered, his voice tight. I just shook my head, not taking my eyes off the woods. "Hear that?" I breathed out. We all stood there, frozen, listening. For a second, there was nothing, just the thick silence. Then it came again. Swish, crush. A slow, heavy displacement. It was moving parallel to us, keeping pace with our trail. The group leader, who was at the front, turned around. He looked at our faces and just nodded slowly. He'd heard it too. He didn't say anything, just pointed forward, signaling for us to keep moving, but to be quiet. My mouth went dry. This wasn't fun anymore. This was a primal kind of alertness, the kind that makes the hair on your arms stand up. Every cell in my body was screaming that we were not alone, and that whatever was with us was not a bear. A bear would have huffed or made some kind of noise. This was just movement. Stealthy, heavy movement. We kept walking, but it was different now. We weren't just hikers. We were prey trying to act casual. I kept my head on a swivel, my eyes straining to see into the gloom. The woods were so thick it was like trying to see through a dirty curtain. I could hear the thing, or whatever it was, matching our pace. It wasn't getting closer, but it wasn't falling behind either. It was just there, a presence in the trees, a secret we all knew but couldn't see. After another 10 minutes of this unbearable tension, the trail started to open up a little. The trees thinned out, and we came into a clearer area. It wasn't a meadow, just a spot where the undergrowth was lower, and you could see a bit further. The ground was still muddy, but there were more rocks poking through. To our right, the land sloped down towards the river, and the trees were taller there, big old oaks and sycamores. I was looking ahead, trying to see where the leader was taking us, when my peripheral vision caught something. My head snapped to the right. There, maybe 50, 60 feet away, halfway up the slope, was a big, horizontal tree branch. It was thick, maybe as thick as my thigh, and it was about 8 or 10 feet off the ground, and hanging down from it from a horizontal position was this long, light brown arm. I know how that sounds. I've played it back in my head 1,000 times, but that's what it was. It was an arm. It was long, and it was covered in what looked like short, light brown hair. It wasn't just dangling, it was fluid. It swung down in a smooth, almost graceful arc, like a person would swing their arm down from a branch they were holding onto. The movement was so natural, so deliberate, it wasn't a branch swaying in the wind. There was no wind. It was a limb being moved by a body. My brain just short-circuited. I couldn't process it. I just stared, my feet rooted to the mud. I opened my mouth, but no sound came out, and at the exact same moment, from right behind me, the twitchy guy let out this choked, gasping sound. It wasn't a scream. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated shock. "I saw it!" he half whispered, half yelled. His voice was trembling so bad I could feel it. "I saw its upper body. It was light brown. It ducked down and swung its arm." I spun around to look at him. His face was white as a sheet, his eyes wide and fixed on the exact spot I was just looking at. He was pointing a shaking finger. That was the moment. That was the terror moment. We hadn't been talking. We hadn't been looking at each other. We were both facing the woods, several feet apart, and we saw the same thing from different angles at the exact same time. He saw the upper body ducking down. I saw the arm swing. He said it was light brown. I saw a light brown arm. This unsolicited confirmation, this independent corroboration that happened in a split second, hit me like a physical blow. A cold wave washed over me, starting at the base of my skull and rushing down my entire body. Every single hair on my arms and neck stood straight up. Goosebumps erupted all over my skin, a violent, prickling chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. My stomach twisted into a hard knot. It was real. It wasn't a trick of the light. It wasn't my imagination. He saw it too. We both saw the same entity. The group leader was instantly on high alert. "What? What did you see?" he asked, his voice low and urgent. The twitchy guy and I started talking over each other, our words tumbling out in a jumble. An arm, long, brown. It ducked. It was huge. We were both pointing at the same cluster of trees. The big, burly guy had his hand on the hunting knife he carried on his belt. His knuckles were white. We all stood there, a tight little group in the mud, staring into the woods. But there was nothing there now. Just stillness. An empty, mocking stillness. The leader told us to be quiet, to listen. We did. The forest had gone completely silent. The crows were gone. There were no squirrels chattering. It was that dead, heavy silence you only get when every living thing for a mile around is holding its breath. The air itself felt thick, charged with something I can only describe as dread. We stood like that for what felt like an hour, but was probably only 2 or 3 minutes. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. We were all waiting for something to happen, for it to show itself again, for a roar, for a rock to come flying out of the trees. Anything. Nothing happened. The leader finally broke the silence. "We need to keep moving. Stay close." But the dynamic had shattered. We weren't an expedition anymore. We were 5 terrified men in the woods who wanted to be anywhere else. We continued down the trail, but now we were huddled together, walking almost shoulder to shoulder. Every rustle of a leaf, every creak of a tree made us jump. My senses were so heightened I could hear my own blood pulsing in my ears. A little further on, The leader pointed off the trail. "That's the general area where the X structure was reported," he said quietly. I looked. It was just more woods, a tangle of fallen logs and brush. I never saw any structure. At that moment, I didn't care. The X structure was the last thing on my mind. All I could think about was that long, light brown arm and the sheer gut-wrenching terror of having someone else see it too. We didn't go off the trail to investigate. We just stood there for a minute. Then, almost on autopilot, I fumbled for my phone. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip it. I didn't know what I was hoping to capture. It was gone. But I felt like I had to do something, to document the spot, to have some kind of proof for myself. I raised the phone and took a photograph. Just a quick, shaky snapshot of the slope, the trees, the branch. The light was flat and grey. The photo, when I looked at it later, was a blurry, useless picture of some woods. It showed nothing, but I took it. It was a reflex, an attempt to anchor the unbelievable in something real. We turned around not long after that. The hike back was a nightmare. We were all facing the direction we'd come from, our backs to the unknown. Every few steps, one of us would glance over our shoulder. The feeling of being watched was so intense, it was like a physical pressure between my shoulder blades. We didn't hear the movement again. The woods were silent the whole way back, which was almost worse. It felt like whatever was out there was letting us go, and that was somehow more frightening than if it had chased us. We got back to the cars as the sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting long, cold shadows. We didn't talk much. We just packed our gear quickly, the unspoken agreement being to get the hell out of there. When we did speak, it was in hushed, fragmented sentences. "You really saw it?" "Yeah." "You saw the body?" "I saw the arm. It moved. It really moved." Jesus. The drive home was a blur. I was exhausted, but my nerves were still jangling, my mind replaying those few seconds over and over, the swing of the arm, the sound of my companion's shocked voice, the icy flood of goosebumps. I never saw the X structure. I don't even know if it exists, but that shared experience, that moment of unsolicited, simultaneous witnessing, solidified something in me forever. It wasn't just a story anymore. It wasn't a legend or a blurry video on the internet. It was a presence. It was real. The awe I feel is not the good kind. It's a deep, humbling and terrifying awe that comes from knowing you are not at the top of the food chain, that there are things in the deep, quiet places of this world that we know nothing about. The fear from that day in Nebraska never really left me. It's a chill that settled in my bones. And sometimes when the house is quiet and the wind blows a certain way, I can still feel it, and I see that long brown arm swinging down from the trees, and I remember that we were not alone. Story 5. It was one of those Oregon afternoons that starts to get dark way too early, the kind where the sky just gives up and lets the gloom take over. Must have been around 4:30. My buddy was in the passenger seat, and we were headed west on Highway 26, just past the summit, I think. The trees were thick on both sides, that deep, dark green that feels like it's swallowing the light. We were just talking, normal stuff, work, whatever game was on that weekend. The drive was familiar. I'd done it 100 times, but that day everything just felt heavy. I had both hands on the wheel, 10 and 2 like my dad taught me, just cruising at a steady 55. The car ahead of us was a dark-colored SUV, maybe a Ford Explorer, a few hundred feet up. Then I saw its brake lights flash, not a hard stop, but a quick, sharp pulse. My foot instinctively lifted off the gas. A second later, its hazard lights started blinking, those orange clicks cutting through the grey. My first thought was, oh crap, a deer. You see that a lot out here. Something darts out, you swerve, you stop. It happens. We were closing the distance, slowing down to maybe 40, when the SUV did something that made my stomach clench. It wasn't a gentle swerve. It was a violent, jerking yank on the wheel to the left, into the oncoming lane for a split second, before snapping back into its own lane. It was so sudden, so panicked, that my own hands tightened on the plastic of the steering wheel. I could feel the ridges of the grip digging into my palms. My friend, he stopped mid-sentence about the Blazers game. "Whoa, what the hell was that?" he said, his voice going up a notch. That's when I saw it. It didn't walk out. It didn't amble. It sprang. From the deep shadows of the tree line on the right-hand side of the road, this thing just launched itself into the open. It was upright, taller than any man I've ever seen, and it moved with a raw, powerful speed that I can't properly describe. It wasn't running like a human. Its legs were pumping, but its upper body was pitched forward, and its long arms. Its arms were swinging down, and its knuckles, I swear to God, its knuckles, touched the pavement for a split second with each stride. It was a knuckle-assisted sprint, just like you see in apes at the zoo. But this was out here, on a public highway, and it was moving faster than anything that big has a right to. It crossed the road diagonally, from our right to our left, angling back behind our car. The whole thing took maybe 2 seconds. It passed so close to the back of my car that if I'd slammed on the brakes, it would have probably smashed right into the trunk. 10 feet away, tops. My eyes were locked on the rearview mirror, then flicked to the side mirror. I got a view, a clear, horrifying view, in that rectangular little glass. It was covered in hair, but it wasn't fur like a bear. It was a thick, shaggy, dark, brownish-black coat, and it was matted in places, wet-looking, like it had been pushing through wet ferns. It had no tail. That was one of the first things my brain registered. No tail. Its head was low, tucked down like a football player making a run, but I could see the profile. It wasn't a human face. It was flatter, with a heavy brow that shadowed its eyes, and a muzzle that pushed out. It wasn't long like a dog's, but it wasn't flat like ours. It was just wrong. The whole shape of it was wrong. The shoulders were massive, hunched and powerful, and the arms were too long, swinging with a purpose that was purely animal. A sound came out of me, a strangled gasp that had no air behind it. My friend made a noise too, a sharp, "Jesus!" That was more breath than word. My foot, still hovering over the brake, finally stomped down. The car lurched, the seatbelt locking against my chest. I was staring into the rearview mirror, watching this thing, this creature, hit the opposite shoulder and vanish into the trees on the left side of the road without even breaking stride. It just disappeared into the shadows like they'd swallowed it whole. The silence in the car was absolute for a heartbeat. Then the world rushed back in. From the opposite direction, a white sedan that had been coming towards us suddenly veered onto its own shoulder, its tires kicking up a plume of gravel and dirt. It skidded to a stop, angled weirdly. They must have seen it too. They must have almost hit it head-on. I could see the driver, a blur of a face, staring wide-eyed into the woods where the thing had vanished. My heart wasn't just beating fast. It was slamming against my ribs, a frantic, painful hammering that made it hard to breathe. I could feel a cold sweat break out all over my body, under my arms, on my back, my forehead. My hands were shaking so badly I had to grip the wheel tighter to keep them still. I looked over at my friend. His face was pale, the color of wet paper. His mouth was hanging open slightly, and he was just staring straight ahead, at the empty road where the thing had been. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice a dry croak. He just nodded, a slow, jerky motion. He couldn't speak. I put my blinker on, my movements feeling robotic and slow, and pulled over onto the wide shoulder behind the SUV that had swerved. The SUV's hazards were still blinking, a steady, mocking click, 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 click. I put my car in park, and the engine idled. A low rumble that felt suddenly alien. My legs felt like jelly. I didn't even know what I was planning to do. Get out, talk to the other driver. The idea of opening my door and stepping out into that air, with those woods right there, felt like the most terrifying thing I could possibly do. I looked in my rearview mirror again. The white sedan on the other side was still there, stopped. I could see the driver had their phone out, held up to their ear, or maybe they were taking a picture. I saw another car, a red pickup truck, slow down as it passed the white sedan, its brake lights glowing. Then another car behind it slowed too. I counted at least 3, maybe 4 vehicles that had to have seen something. There was a traffic hiccup, a ripple of disruption caused by what we had just witnessed. We sat there for what felt like an hour, but was probably only 2 or 3 minutes. The driver of the SUV never got out. I could see a silhouette in the driver's seat, just sitting there. Maybe they were as frozen as we were. My friend finally found his voice. "What the hell was that?" he whispered, his voice shaky. "Was that a bear?" "It wasn't a bear," I said, and the certainty in my own voice surprised me. My mind was racing, trying to fit what I'd seen into a known box. A person in a suit? No. The speed, the raw muscle, the way it moved, that wasn't a person. The proportions were all wrong. The power in its stride was real, visceral. I'd seen the way its shoulders bunched and released with each swing of its arms. I'd seen the way its head stayed low, not looking at the road, just focused on its path. A person in a suit would have looked. They would have hesitated. This thing didn't hesitate. It was an animal. It was just an animal that walked on 2 legs and was the size of a refrigerator. The white sedan on the other side suddenly pulled back onto the road and drove off, slowly at first, then picking up speed. The red pickup followed. The moment was breaking up. The SUV in front of us finally pulled away, its hazards clicking off as it merged back into the lane and accelerated, faster than before, like it was trying to outrun the memory. "We should go," my friend said, his voice urgent. "Just go." I nodded, put the car in drive, and pulled back onto the highway. My foot was heavy on the gas. I pushed it up to 60, then 65. I just wanted to put distance between us and that stretch of road. We didn't speak for the next 10 miles. The only sound was the hum of the tires on the pavement and the frantic thumping in my ears. I kept checking my mirrors, not for cops, but for any movement in the trees, any dark shape keeping pace with us. Every shadow between the trunks looked like it could coalesce into that form again. The feeling in the car was thick with fear. It was a physical thing, a weight pressing down on us. My skin was still crawling, that pins and needles feeling you get when you're utterly terrified. I could smell my own fear, a sharp, coppery scent. My friend kept rubbing his hands on his jeans like he was trying to wipe something off them. When we finally got to a town, a little place with a gas station and a diner, I pulled off. We went into the diner, not because we were hungry, but because we needed to be around other people under bright lights. We slid into a booth, and the vinyl seat creaked under me. We ordered coffee, and when the waitress left, we just looked at each other. "We all saw it," I said quietly. That SUV, the car that almost hit it, the other cars. We all saw the same thing. My friend just stirred his coffee, the spoon clinking against the mug. "What was it?" he asked again. But it wasn't a question for me anymore. It was a question for the universe. We sat there for a long time, not talking much, just sipping our coffee and trying to act normal. I kept replaying it in my head, that 2-second film clip on a loop, the spring from the trees, the powerful, knuckle-dragging sprint, the dark, matted hair, the low, non-human head, the sheer impossible size of it. Every detail was burned into my brain. I looked for news that night. I scanned the local channels, checked the websites for the county sheriff, the Oregon State Police. Nothing, not a word. No reports of a strange animal sighting. No reports of a hazardous creature on the highway. No reports of a person in a gorilla suit causing a traffic incident. Nothing. It was like it never happened. But it did happen. I saw it. My friend saw it. And I know, with a certainty that sits deep in my bones, that at least 3 other cars full of people saw it too. The question that haunts me, the one I can't shake, isn't just what was it? The question is, why didn't anyone else say anything? Why did we all just drive away and pretend it didn't happen? It's been years now, and not a single story, not a single report has ever surfaced from that day. It's our secret, mine and my friends, and the secret of a handful of strangers who were on Highway 26 that one gloomy afternoon. And sometimes, late at night, I think about that creature, moving through those deep, dark Oregon woods, and I wonder if it's still out there, and I wonder why the world is so determined not to see it. Story 6. All right, I'll just get this out. I've been putting it off for a while, but I need to tell someone, even if it's just strangers online. I don't talk about it with people I know, because they'd either think I'm crazy or just telling a tall tale. But this happened. It's real. So this was last summer, on a Tuesday afternoon. I remember it was a Tuesday because I'd taken the day off work just to get out of the house. My job had been pretty stressful, and my favorite way to unwind is to take my kayak out on this little creek near where I live. It's not a popular spot, which is why I like it. You have to drive down this old logging road for about 20 minutes, then hike your kayak through a bit of woods to get to the put-in point. It's quiet. Usually the only sounds are the water, the birds, and the wind in the pines. This particular day was perfect. The sun was high and bright, but not too hot. There was a nice breeze. The water was clear and calm, just moving along at a lazy pace. I'd packed a lunch, a couple of bottles of water, and just planned to let the current take me for a few hours. I wasn't in a hurry to be anywhere. I remember thinking how peaceful it was, how the sunlight was dappling through the canopy and sparkling on the water. I'd done this trip dozens of times. I knew every bend, every fallen log you have to steer around. It was my place. I was about an hour in, just floating, not even paddling. My paddle was resting across my lap, and I was just watching the trees go by. My mind was completely blank, just soaking in the calm. That's when I heard the first splash. It was off to my right, maybe 10 feet from the kayak. A big splash, like someone had thrown a decent-sized rock into the water. I figured it was a fish, a big bass, or something jumping. It happens. I didn't think much of it. I just turned my head to look at the ripples. Then there was another one, closer this time, a bigger splash, right beside my kayak. Water sprayed up and hit my arm. That got my attention. It felt intentional. The kayak rocked a little from the disturbance. I sat up straighter, my hand going to the paddle. What the hell? I muttered to myself. I scanned the water, looking for a beaver or an otter, something that could make a splash like that. Then a rock, an actual rock about the size of my fist, skipped across the surface of the water right in front of my bow. It didn't land with a plop. It skipped, like a flat stone, 2 to 3 times before it sank. My heart did this weird little stutter in my chest. That wasn't an animal. Rocks don't skip themselves. Another one hit the water on my left side, this one bigger. It didn't skip, it just plunged straight down with a heavy thwump that sent a wave against the side of my kayak. I stopped floating. I was completely still, my fingers gripping the paddle shaft so tight my knuckles were white. My heart wasn't just beating fast anymore, it was slamming against my ribs. A frantic, panic drumming I could feel in my ears. All the peace of the afternoon was gone, replaced by this thick, heavy dread. The woods, which had felt so friendly and familiar just seconds before, now felt like they were closing in. I looked toward the bank where the rocks were coming from. The bank was steep there, covered in ferns and thick undergrowth, with big hemlock and cedar trees growing right to the edge. At first, I didn't see anything, just shadows and leaves. Then I saw movement, low to the ground, in the deep shade beneath a giant cedar. Something was crouched there. It was a dark shape, blotting out the ferns behind it. My brain tried to make it into a bear. I've seen black bears out here before, but the shape was wrong. It was lankier, and it was crouched on 2 legs, not 4. As I stared, frozen, the thing stood up. It didn't rise slowly like a person getting up from a squat. It just unfolded. It was incredibly fast. One second it was a hunched shape in the ferns. The next it was towering. I mean, towering. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, maybe more. Its head was sloped like a gorilla's, but bigger. Its shoulders were massive, rounded and powerful looking, and its arms... God, its arms were so long. They hung down past its knees, swinging slightly as it stood there. Its whole body was covered in this shaggy, dark brown hair that was almost black in the shadows, and it was looking right at me. We locked eyes. That's the part that's burned into my brain more than anything else. That face. It wasn't a bear's face. It wasn't a man's face. It was something else entirely. The eyes were deep set, and they held this intelligence. It wasn't a dumb animal stare. It was a look of assessment. It was studying me. Its gaze wasn't angry, and it wasn't curious in a simple way. It was like it was sizing me up, figuring out what I was and what I was doing there. There was no malice in it, but there was no friendliness either. It was just this cold, calm, calculating look that made the blood freeze in my veins. Time just stopped. The gurgle of the creek, the chirping of the birds, it all faded away. There was just this silent communication between me and this thing on the bank. I couldn't move, I couldn't breathe. I was pinned by that gaze. I remember the smell too. It hit me all at once. A heavy, musky odor like wet dog and old meat and something else. Something earthy and foul I can't describe. It was so strong, it made my eyes water. The whole encounter, from when it stood up to when it left, probably only lasted 10 or 15 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Then it broke the stare. It turned its head, looked back into the woods, and then it moved. It didn't run like a man. It didn't lope like a bear. It just crashed into the trees. It didn't go around anything. It went through them. I heard the sound of branches, some as thick as my wrist, snapping like twigs. The sound was incredible, a series of loud cracks and crashes that echoed through the forest. It moved with a speed that was just impossible. 1 second it was there on the bank, and in 2 or 3 bounds it was gone, swallowed by the woods, the sound of its passage fading fast into the distance. The spell was broken. I gasped, like I'd been holding my breath the whole time. I was trembling all over, a full-body shake that made the kayak shiver in the water. I fumbled with my paddle, my hands so slick with sweat I could barely hold on. I started paddling, not downstream where I'd been going, but back upstream, against the current toward my car. I didn't care how hard it was. I had to get out of there. My mind was racing, a jumble of terrified thoughts. What was that? What the hell was that? I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see it following me along the bank. But there was nothing. Just the quiet, empty woods. That almost made it worse. The normalcy of the scene was a lie. I knew what was in there now. The paddleback was a nightmare. Every little sound, a squirrel chattering, a branch creaking, made me jump. My heart didn't slow down the entire time. I was drenched in a cold sweat. I remember my throat was so dry it hurt, but I was too scared to stop and take a drink of water. I just paddled, my arms burning with the effort of fighting the current. When I finally got back to the put-in point, I practically fell out of the kayak, dragging it up the bank. I didn't even bother to strap it to my car properly. I just threw it in the back of my SUV, got in, locked the doors, and sat there for a good 10 minutes, just trying to breathe. I kept looking at the tree line, half expecting to see those deep-set eyes staring back at me from the shadows. I drove home in a daze. My hands were still shaking on the steering wheel. When I got home, I went straight to the shower and stood under the hot water for a long time, but I couldn't wash away the feeling of that thing's gaze on me, or the memory of that smell. As the evening wore on, a weird kind of resolve settled over me. The initial blind terror had faded a little, replaced by a need for, I don't know, confirmation, proof. I couldn't just accept that this had happened and never think about it again. I felt like I had to go back. I know how stupid that sounds. It was the dumbest idea I've ever had, but I couldn't shake it. So, later that night, around 10 o'clock, I drove back out there. I took a powerful spotlight I use for camping. I didn't get out of the car. I parked on the logging road right near the trailhead to the creek. I rolled my window down and just listened. The woods were dead quiet. No crickets, no owls, nothing. It was an unnatural silence that made the hair on my arm stand up. I took a deep breath and I called out. I didn't yell hello or anything. I just said kinda loud, "Are you there?" Nothing. I waited a minute, the silence pressing in on me. I shined the spotlight into the trees, but the beam just got swallowed by the darkness. I called out again, "I saw you today," and then I heard it. From deep in the woods, off to the north, came a sound, a loud, wooden thwack, like someone had hit a tree with a giant baseball bat. It was a single, sharp report that echoed through the stillness. My breath caught in my throat. I stayed perfectly still, listening. A few seconds later, from a slightly different direction, came another one. Thwack. Just as loud, just as clear. Then, after another pause, a third one answered from even farther away. Thwack. It was a response, I'm sure of it. It wasn't a random branch falling. It was too deliberate, too spaced out. 3 knocks. I didn't call out again. I just sat there in my car, my skin crawling, listening to the silence that had returned. The knocks had stopped. It felt like a conversation had just ended, and I hadn't understood a word of it. I rolled up my window, started the car, and got the hell out of there. I haven't been back to that creek since. I still go kayaking, but I stick to big, busy lakes now. I don't go into the deep woods alone anymore. I can't. That was almost a year ago. I still think about it every day. I see that face in my dreams sometimes, that assessing, intelligent gaze. I don't know what it was. I don't like to use the word everyone thinks of, but I know what I saw. I know what I heard, and I know that something out there in those woods saw me too, and it knew I was there. The terror of that close encounter, of being so completely and utterly seen by something so other, it never really leaves you. It's just there, under the surface, making you wary of shadows and silence. I was just kayaking down a familiar creek one bright, calm afternoon, and then I wasn't, and I haven't felt truly calm since. Story 7. Okay, I'll try to capture this. It's still so hard to talk about, even now, typing it out. I'm just going to start from the beginning of that day and get it all down. I need to get it out, and maybe someone here will believe me. That morning, I woke up in my tent feeling pretty good. It was a Tuesday in late September, and I'd taken a couple days off work to get some solitude. The air was crisp, the kind that feels clean in your lungs, and the sky was this pale, endless blue. I was camped in the high lakes country of the Mount Washington wilderness, not far from the Pacific Crest Trail. I'd been coming out here for years, always alone. It was my thing, my reset button. I loved the silence, the way the only sounds were my own footsteps and the wind in the trees. I made my coffee on my little camp stove, the metal pot clinking softly. I remember thinking how perfect it was. No emails, no phone service, just me and the pines and the jagged line of the mountains against the sky. I packed my day pack carefully, extra water, a filter, some jerky and trail mix, my rain shell just in case, and my camera. I always brought my camera, though I mostly took pictures of landscapes. I never expected to see anything else. I hit the trail around 8 in the morning. The plan was to do a big loop, maybe 12 miles, skirting around a couple of the smaller, less visited lakes. The trail was rugged, a mix of dirt and volcanic rock weaving through these huge hemlock and fir trees. The sunlight came down in broken pieces through the canopy. For the first few hours, it was perfect. Just a normal, beautiful day. I remember the smell of damp earth and pine needles, that specific scent of an Oregon forest. I saw some deer tracks, a pile of fresh scat that I figured was from an elk. Normal stuff. It was probably around noon when things started to feel off. I'd stopped for a break by a creek, sitting on a mossy log to eat a granola bar. The forest had gotten quiet. Not just peaceful quiet, but a dead quiet. The birdsong had stopped. The constant chatter of squirrels and chipmunks had just vanished. It was like someone had thrown a switch. I remember feeling a little prickling on the back of my neck, that primitive feeling of being watched. I shrugged it off, told myself I was being silly, that maybe a hawk had flown over and scared the little guys into hiding. I packed up and kept walking, but the silence stayed with me. It was heavy. My footsteps seemed too loud. The rustle of my jacket against my pack was suddenly grating. I started looking around more, scanning the trees. Everything looked normal. The gnarled roots, the clumps of fern, the shafts of light. But the feeling wouldn't go away. It was a deep, gut-level unease, the kind you can't logic away. Then the smell hit me. It was downwind at first, just a faint whiff. I thought maybe I'd passed a dead animal, a deer, or something that had died close to the trail. But as I walked further, it got stronger. It's hard to describe. It wasn't just decay, it was foul, like rotten meat, sure, but mixed with something else, something musky and old, like a wet dog that had been left in a closed-up room for a month, or a garbage dump on a hot day. It was thick and cloying, sticking in the back of my throat. I pulled the collar of my shirt up over my nose, but it didn't help. The smell was everywhere. My heart was starting to beat a little faster. This wasn't right. A dead animal wouldn't smell this strong, not out here in the open air. I remember my hand going to the bear spray on my hip strap. It was a reflex. I'd never had to use it, but it was a comfort. I kept walking, slower now, each step feeling deliberate. The trail curved around a thicket of young trees and opened up into a small, rocky clearing. The smell was overpowering here, making my eyes water, and that's when I saw it. On the other side of the clearing, maybe 30 feet away, standing between two big fir trees, was this figure. My brain just froze for a second. It couldn't process what I was seeing. It was huge. I'm 6 feet tall, and this thing absolutely dwarfed me. 8 feet tall, easy, maybe more. It was covered in hair, but not like a bear's fur. This was coarse, stringy, and matted. It was a dark, dirty brown, almost black in places, like it had been rubbing against charcoal or mud. It was just standing there, half turned away from me, and it was massive. Its shoulders were impossibly broad, sloping down to these long, powerful-looking arms. Its legs were thick like tree trunks. I could see the muscles bunching under that thick coat of hair. It wasn't moving. It was just a statue. My breath caught in my chest. I couldn't inhale. I couldn't exhale. I was just stuck, my feet glued to the ground. This wasn't a bear. I've seen black bears. This was all wrong. The proportions were wrong. It was too tall, too upright. It looked prehistoric. That's the only word that came to me even then, like something that had walked out of another time. My eyes were fixed on it, tracing the shape of its back, the sheer bulk of it, and then, as if it felt my stare, it started to turn. It moved its head first, slowly. The movement wasn't jerky or animal-like. It was deliberate, and then its whole upper body rotated towards me. That's when I saw its face. It was framed by this dark, shaggy hair, but the face itself was darker, almost like leather. It had a heavy brow, a flat nose, and its eyes. Oh God, its eyes. They weren't the small, dumb eyes of a deer or a bear. They were intelligent. They were deep-set and dark, and they locked right onto mine. Time just stopped. I was staring into the eyes of this thing, and it was staring right back. There was no anger there, not at first. It was more like a deep, ancient curiosity, a recognition. It knew I was there, it knew I was a person, and in that single stretched-out second, I felt a terror so complete, so absolute, that it felt like my insides had turned to ice. This wasn't just fear, this was a primal understanding that I was in the presence of something I was never meant to see, something that shouldn't exist. My mind was screaming, 100 thoughts at once. What is that? Is that a person in a suit? No, no way. It's too big the way it moves. Bigfoot. That's not real. That's not real. That's not... And then it moved. The spell broke. Its eyes widened just a fraction, and in one fluid, impossibly fast motion, it spun away from me. It didn't run like a man or an ape. It was this powerful, coiled spring of movement. It took 2 strides, just 2. Its legs covered so much ground it was unbelievable. One moment it was there, and with its second step, it went up and over a small rise in the land, a little ridge covered in huckleberry bushes, and it was gone. Just gone. The silence rushed back in, louder than before. The smell was still there, choking me. I was still frozen, my hand clenched around the bear spray I hadn't even thought to use. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it would burst. I could feel a cold sweat soaking through my shirt under my pack. I stood there for what felt like an hour, but it was probably only 10 or 20 seconds. My body finally unlocked. A violent shudder ran through me from head to toe. I took a gasping, ragged breath, and the rotten air filled my lungs, making me cough and gag. Run. The thought was pure instinct. It wasn't a decision. It was a command from every cell in my body. I turned and I ran. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. I just ran. My pack, which had felt light all morning, was now a heavy, jostling burden, slamming against my back with every step. I wasn't thinking about the trail. I wasn't thinking about navigation. I was just running blind, fueled by pure, undiluted adrenaline. My legs burned. My lungs screamed for air, but I didn't slow down. I could still smell it. I could still see its eyes. Every shadow between the trees was a threat. Every snap of a twig under my own feet sounded like it was right behind me. I expected to feel a massive hand on my shoulder at any second, to be dragged down into the ferns. I kept imagining it, that thing, moving silently through the trees, just out of sight, keeping pace with me. I swear I could hear something moving parallel to the trail, a heavy rhythmic rustling in the undergrowth, but it might have just been the blood roaring in my ears. I don't know how long I ran. Time lost all meaning. It was just terror and motion. My world had shrunk to the patch of trail in front of my feet and the desperate need to get away. I tripped once, my foot catching on a root, and I went down hard on my hands and knees. The impact jarred my teeth. I scrambled back up without even stopping, my palms stinging and bleeding, and kept running. The fear of falling was nothing compared to the fear of what was behind me. Somehow, my body knew the way back. My subconscious must have been tracking the turns, because I found myself on the final descent towards the trailhead without consciously remembering any of the journey. The trees started to thin out. I saw a glimpse of the gravel parking lot through the branches. That's when I finally risked a glance over my shoulder. Nothing, just the empty, silent trail winding back into the dark of the forest. But the feeling of being watched was still there, pressing down on me like a physical weight. I burst out of the tree line and into the parking lot. It was empty except for my truck, sitting alone under the grey sky. I fumbled for my keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get them out of my pocket. I dropped them on the gravel, snatched them up and unlocked the door. I threw my pack into the passenger seat and practically fell into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut and hitting the lock button over and over again until I heard all the doors click. I sat there gripping the steering wheel, my whole body trembling uncontrollably. I was gasping for breath, sweat pouring down my face, mixing with the dirt and the blood from my scraped knees. I looked at myself in the rearview mirror. My eyes were wide, wild. I looked like a different person. I started the engine and didn't even wait for it to warm up. I just threw it in reverse and then into drive, spraying gravel as I sped out of the parking lot and onto the Forest Service Road. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I just drove, watching the forest fly by my windows, half expecting to see that dark, massive shape step out onto the road behind me. It was only when I hit the paved highway miles away that I finally let myself slow down a little. I pulled over at the first viewpoint I came to, my truck shuddering to a halt. I turned off the engine and just sat there in the sudden quiet. The only sound was my ragged breathing and the ticking of the engine as it cooled. I looked down at my hands. They were still shaking. I looked at my dirty, bloody knees. It was real. It had happened. I sat there for a long time, just staring at the steering wheel, seeing its face every time I closed my eyes. That dark, framed face, those intelligent, ancient eyes, the sheer, unbelievable size of it, the way it moved with such impossible power and grace. The smell. God, I could still smell it in my nose, in my clothes. I've replayed that moment 1,000 times, the moment our eyes met. It wasn't a monster, it wasn't a beast, it was a living thing, and it saw me. It knew I was there, and it was just as shocked to see me as I was to see it. I've never gone back. Not to that part of the wilderness, and never alone, that solo freedom I loved so much. It's gone. It was stolen from me in those few seconds. My friends think I'm crazy, or that I just saw a bear and spooked myself. I let them think that. It's easier. But I know what I saw. My camera was in my pack the whole time. I never even thought to lift it. I was too busy being frozen, and then I was too busy running for my life. Sometimes I wonder if a picture would have made a difference, but I think some things aren't meant to be proven. They're just meant to be experienced and survived, and I have this memory, this perfect, horrifying image burned into my brain, and the feeling that for one single, terrifying moment, I looked at something that wasn't supposed to be looked at, and it looked right back. Story 8. So, this happened a few years back, but it's one of those things that stuck with me like a bad dream you can't shake. I was driving north on Highway 441 and 71 with my wife and another couple, my buddy from work and his wife, heading from North Carolina into Tennessee toward Gatlinburg. We'd planned this weekend trip for ages, just a chance to get away from the daily grind, maybe do some hiking, enjoy the mountains. It was early evening, the kind of time where the sun's already dipped below the peaks, but there's still a bit of light hanging on, enough to see the outlines of things without needing headlights just yet. The air had that cool, crisp feel you get in the fall, and the leaves were starting to turn, all oranges and reds, but in the fading light, everything was taking on this grayish hue. We'd been on the road for a couple of hours, chatting about nothing in particular. Work, the kids, what we wanted to do in Gatlinburg. I was behind the wheel, my wife in the passenger seat, and our friends in the back. The car was an old SUV, nothing fancy, but it handled the curves okay. We had the windows cracked open a bit, letting in that fresh mountain air, and the radio was playing some soft rock station, low enough that we could talk over it. I remember feeling relaxed, just cruising along, the road winding through these dense woods, the trees crowding in on both sides like walls. Every now and then, we'd pass a small town or a cluster of houses, but mostly it was just us and the wilderness. As we crossed into Tennessee, the highway straightened out for a bit, one of those rare stretches where you can see for a good distance ahead. The streetlights were spaced far apart, casting these pools of yellowish light on the asphalt, with long stretches of darkness in between. It was quiet too. Not many other cars around, just the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. I had my hands on the wheel, my wife was dozing off a little, and our friends were laughing about some story from their last vacation. Everything felt normal, you know, like any other drive. Then, out of nowhere, something moved up ahead. We were probably doing about 50 miles an hour, not speeding, just keeping a steady pace. In the distance, under one of those streetlights, something large stepped into the path of the light from the left side of the road. At first, I thought it was a deer. You see them all the time in these parts, especially around dusk. But as it moved into the light, I realized it was way too big for a deer. My brain kind of stuttered, trying to make sense of it. This thing was over 6 feet tall, maybe even 7, and it was covered in dark, thick hair that looked almost black in the light. It walked upright on two legs, with long arms swinging at its sides, and it crossed the highway from left to right in a few quick strides. I swear, my heart just dropped into my stomach. I felt this cold sweat break out on my forehead, and my hands tightened on the wheel. I must have gasped or something because my wife jerked awake and asked what was wrong. But I couldn't get the words out. I just stared, my eyes glued to this thing as it moved. The lighting from the streetlights outlined its body, and it had this ape-like build. Big, broad shoulders, a thick torso, and a slightly hunched posture. It wasn't loping or clumsy. It moved smoothly, almost gracefully, but in a way that was totally unnatural. Like it walked like a man, but it didn't look human at all. No clothes, no gear, just this massive, hairy figure. It reached the tree line on the right side of the road in what felt like seconds, and then it just vanished into the darkness. One moment it was there, clear as day under the light, and the next it was gone, swallowed up by the woods. The whole thing couldn't have taken more than 3 or 4 seconds, but it felt like time had slowed down. I remember the way its arms swung, long and loose, like it was used to moving that way. And the silence. There was no sound, no grunt or crash, nothing, just the quiet of the night and the hum of our car. For a second, nobody in the car said anything. We were all just frozen, staring at the spot where it had disappeared. Then my wife whispered, "Did you see that? It walked like a man, but it didn't look like one." Her voice was shaky, and I could hear the fear in it. I nodded, my throat too dry to speak. In the back, our friends were muttering, asking what the hell that was. My buddy said, "Was that a bear? But bears don't walk like that." I shook my head. I've seen bears, and this was nothing like a bear. Bears are bulkier, they don't move that upright, and they're not that tall. This thing was leaner in a way, but still massive. I slowed the car down, my foot trembling on the brake. We were approaching the spot where it had crossed, and I could feel this dread building in my chest. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might burst out. I pulled over to the shoulder, not too close to where it went into the woods, but close enough that we could see the area. The engine idled, and we all just sat there for a minute listening. The woods were pitch black beyond the tree line, and dead silent. No crickets, no owls, nothing. It was like the forest was holding its breath. I turned to the others and said, "We need to check this out." My voice came out all rough and uneven. My wife grabbed my arm and said, "No, don't go out there. What if it's still around?" But I couldn't help it. I had to see if there was any trace, anything that could explain what we'd just seen. I opened the door slowly, the interior light clicking on, and stepped out onto the gravel shoulder. The air was cold now, and I shivered, not just from the temperature. I could feel the hairs on my arms standing up. I walked a few steps toward the tree line, my shoes crunching on the gravel, and peered into the darkness. It was so thick, I couldn't see more than a few feet in. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing. Just this overwhelming sense of being watched. I stood there for what felt like ages, my breath fogging in the air, and I kept expecting something to move in the trees, but there was nothing. The silence was deafening. Back in the car, my wife had rolled down her window and was calling me to come back. Her voice was tight with fear. I finally turned around and got back in, my hands shaking as I gripped the wheel. I locked the doors, and we just sat there for a minute, nobody saying anything. The radio was still playing some cheesy love song, and it felt so out of place that I reached over and turned it off. We started driving again, but the mood in the car had completely changed. Before, we were all relaxed and joking. Now, it was like we were in a funeral procession. My wife kept glancing out the window, her knuckles white where she was gripping the door handle. Our friends in the back were quiet, and I could see in the rearview mirror that they looked pale. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a person in a costume, or some kind of animal we'd misidentified, but deep down, I knew that wasn't it. The way it moved, the size of it, the sheer otherness. It wasn't human, and it wasn't any animal I'd ever seen or heard of. We drove the rest of the way to Gatlinburg in near silence, only speaking to point out directions or ask if anyone else needed a break. Every time we passed a dark patch of woods, I felt my stomach clench. I kept replaying the sighting in my head over and over. The image was burned into my mind. That tall, hairy figure striding across the road, its arms swinging, and then disappearing into the blackness. It was so vivid, so real, I could still see the way the light caught on its fur, making it look almost glossy. When we finally got to our cabin, it was full dark and we all hurried inside, locking the door behind us. We didn't talk much that night. We just kind of went through the motions, unpacking, making dinner, but the energy was off. Later, when we were all sitting around the living room, my buddy brought it up. He said, "I've never believed in that Bigfoot stuff, but after tonight..." He didn't finish the sentence, but we all knew what he meant. My wife nodded and said she felt the same. She told me that when she saw it, she felt this primal fear, like something out of a nightmare. I didn't sleep well that night. Every little noise outside had me jumping, and I kept thinking about what we'd seen. The next day, we tried to go about our plans. We hiked a bit, visited some shops in Gatlinburg, but it was like a shadow hanging over us. We didn't see anything else unusual, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, even though I knew it was probably just my imagination running wild. That experience on Highway 441 near Gatlinburg changed something in me. Before that, I'd always been skeptical about cryptids and all that. Bigfoot, Yeti, whatever. I thought it was just stories people made up to scare each other around campfires. But now I know better. I saw it with my own eyes, and so did 3 other people. We all described the same thing: tall, hairy, walking on 2 legs, not human. There's no explaining it away. It solidified my belief in Bigfoot's existence, not as some myth, but as a real, living thing out there in those mountains. To this day, I get chills thinking about it. Every time I drive that stretch of road, especially at dusk, I find myself scanning the tree lines, half expecting to see it again, but I never have. It's like it vanished into thin air, leaving us with this memory that haunts me. I've told the story to a few close friends, but most of them just laugh it off or say we must have seen a bear. But I know what I saw, and nothing will ever convince me otherwise. It's proof, at least to me, that there are wild mysteries in those mountains that we don't understand, and maybe we're not meant to. Story 9. I was inside the house, just finishing up some laundry and thinking about heading to bed. It was probably around 11 o'clock, and the house was quiet except for the hum of the fridge and the TV playing some late-night show in the background. My son, who was 18 at the time, had been out on the back porch for a while. He's a hunter, has been, since he was old enough to hold a rifle, and he's not the type to spook easily. He's calm, level-headed, the kind of kid who'd rather sit in a deer stand for hours than be inside playing video games. So when I heard his voice from the porch, it immediately put me on edge. He wasn't yelling, but there was this tight, shaky quality to it that I'd never heard before. "Dad," he said, and I could tell he was trying to keep it together, but the fear was right there, bubbling under the surface. "You need to come out here. Now, bring the spotlight and the shotgun." My heart just dropped. I didn't ask questions. I grabbed the spotlight from the closet and the shotgun from the rack by the door. The spotlight is one of those big, heavy things with a handle, the kind you plug into a car lighter, but we had an extension cord running out to the porch for times like this. The shotgun was loaded just in case, but I never thought I'd actually need it for anything serious. As I rushed through the kitchen, my hands were already sweating, and I could feel this cold knot in my stomach. The back door was open, screen door shut, and I pushed it open to step onto the porch. The air outside was cool and damp, with that earthy smell you get after a light rain. The porch light was off, so it was mostly dark, but the moon was out, casting long shadows across the yard. My son was standing there, his back to me, staring out into the darkness. When he turned around, I swear, I've never seen him look like that. His face was pale, almost grey, and his eyes were wide, fixed on something in the distance. He was breathing fast, like he'd been running, but he hadn't moved from the spot. "Over there," he whispered, pointing toward the oak tree between the two sheds. The sheds are about 30 yards from the house, old wooden things we use for storing tools and hunting gear, and the oak tree is massive, with thick branches that spread out like arms. I lifted the spotlight and clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, sweeping across the grass and the sheds. At first, I didn't see anything, just the tree, the sheds, the usual stuff. But my son reached over and guided my arm, his hand trembling. "A little to the left," he said, his voice barely audible. I adjusted the light, and that's when I saw it, or part of it anyway. There was this large, brownish-red, hairy figure using the tree for cover. It was pressed against the trunk, but I could make out its shape. Broad shoulders, long arms hanging down past its knees, and legs that had a slight bend, like it was crouching or ready to move. The hair was matted and thick, almost like a bear's, but it wasn't a bear. I've seen bears out here, and this was different. My breath caught in my throat. I kept the light steady, and for a second, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the thing peeked out from behind the tree. It had an ape-like face, with a heavy brow and deep-set eyes that reflected the light. It reminded me of that character Harry from Harry and the Hendersons, but there was no friendliness there, just this intense, curious stare that sent chills down my spine. It was like it was studying us, trying to figure out what we were. When I shifted the light away, it leaned out a bit more, almost cautiously, like it wanted to see better. But the moment I swung the beam back, it ducked behind the tree again, quick and silent. My son and I didn't say much. We were both frozen, just watching. I could feel my heart hammering against my ribs, and my palms were so slick I had to readjust my grip on the spotlight. The shotgun was slung over my shoulder, but I didn't even think about using it. This thing wasn't acting aggressive. It was just there, hiding and peeking like some weird game of hide and seek. After a minute or so, I got this idea to turn the light off and on quickly to see what would happen. I clicked it off, and for a second, everything went black. The night sounds seemed louder suddenly, the crickets, the distant hoot of an owl. Then I clicked it back on, and that's when it stood up fully exposed. It was huge, taller than any man I've ever seen, must have been 7 or 8 feet tall. The hair was a reddish brown, and it covered its whole body except for parts of its face, which was dark and wrinkled. It squinted in the beam, like the light hurt its eyes, and it raised one of those long arms to shield its face. For a heartbeat, we just stared at each other. I could see its chest moving as it breathed, and there was this low, guttural sound, almost a growl, but not quite. Then, without warning, it turned and bolted into the woods behind the tree. The sound was incredible, cracking branches, snapping twigs, like a small truck plowing through the undergrowth. It moved fast, crashing away into the darkness, and within seconds the noise faded, and it was gone. We stood there for what felt like forever, just listening. The spotlight was still on, shining on the empty spot where it had been. My son finally let out a breath he'd been holding, and I realized I was shaking all over. My legs felt weak, and I had to lean against the porch railing to steady myself. The air felt colder now, and I could smell something odd. A musky, animal scent that hung in the air, like wet dog and dirt mixed together. We didn't go back inside right away. We stayed on the porch, scanning the woods with the light, but there was nothing. No movement, no sound except the normal night noises slowly returning. My son was the first to speak. "What was that, Dad?" he asked, and his voice was still shaky. I didn't have an answer. I've spent my whole life in these woods, hunting, fishing, camping. I've seen bobcats, bears, even a panther once. But this was nothing I'd ever encountered. It wasn't an animal I could name, and it wasn't a person in a costume. No one could move that fast or make that much noise without tripping or something. After a while, we went inside and locked the doors, even though we both knew locks wouldn't do much against something that size. We sat at the kitchen table, not talking much, just drinking water and trying to process what happened. I kept replaying it in my head, the way it peeked out, the way it stood there squinting, the sheer size of it. My hands wouldn't stop trembling, and every little noise from outside made me jump. The house felt smaller, like the walls were closing in, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. We decided not to call anyone. What would we say? That we saw Bigfoot? People would think we were crazy. Plus, we didn't want to draw attention to the property. So we just sat there, waiting for the sun to come up. I don't think either of us slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that face, those eyes, and I'd jolt awake. The next part is where it gets even weirder, but I'll stick to that night since that's when the main horror happened. Later, after we'd calmed down a bit, we started hearing things. Odd knocks from the woods, like something hitting a tree, and these deep, guttural howls that didn't sound like any animal I know. They'd come every now and then, echoing through the trees, and each time my son and I would exchange looks without saying a word. It was like whatever it was hadn't fully left, or maybe it was letting us know it was still around. I remember at one point I went to the window and peered out, but it was too dark to see anything. The spotlight was still on the porch, but I didn't have the nerve to go back out and use it. Instead, I just stood there, feeling this overwhelming sense of vulnerability. My son eventually fell asleep on the couch, but I stayed up, listening. The knocks would start soft, then get louder, like whatever was out there was testing us, seeing how we'd react. Once, there was a series of 3 quick knocks, followed by a long, low howl that made the hair on my arms stand up. It sounded close, maybe just beyond the tree line, and I found myself gripping the shotgun tighter, even though I knew deep down I probably wouldn't use it. As the night wore on, the sounds tapered off, but the fear didn't. I kept thinking about how casual everything had started, just a normal evening, and then boom, our world turned upside down. I thought about my son's face when I first saw him on the porch, how scared he was, and it made me angry in a way, angry that something had shaken him like that, angry that I couldn't protect him from whatever this was. By the time the sky started to lighten, I was exhausted, both mentally and physically. My eyes felt gritty, and my head was pounding. We eventually went out the next morning to look around, but that's a story for another time. What matters is that night. In those hours after it happened, I felt this deep, primal fear that I've never experienced before or since. It wasn't just about the creature itself. It was about the unknown, the realization that there are things out there we can't explain, no matter how much we think we know about the world. Even now, years later, I'll sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, hearing those knocks in my dreams, and I'll have to get up and check the windows. My son doesn't talk about it much, but I know it affected him too. He's still a hunter, but he's more cautious now, more aware of the shadows in the woods. I don't know what we saw that night. Maybe it was a Sasquatch, like people say, or maybe it was something else entirely. But I do know this. It was real, it was terrifying, and it's something I'll never forget. The way it moved, the way it looked at us, it's burned into my memory forever. And every time I step outside at night, I can't help but feel like those eyes are still out there, watching. Story 10. It was one of those days that just wears you down to the bone. Me and Jake McCoy had been out since before first light, working a timber claim deep in the woods. The sun was a real brute, beating down through the canopy, and the air was so thick with heat and sawdust you could near enough chew it. Our axes felt like they weighed 100 pounds each by the time we decided to call it. We were both drenched in sweat, our shirts sticking to our backs, and all we could think about was getting to the creek to wash off the grime and cool down. The creek wasn't far from where we'd been felling, a 10-minute walk through thick brush. It was a pretty spot, I'll give it that. The water was clear and cold, running over smooth stones, and the trees leaned over it like they were guarding a secret. We found our usual spot, a flat, sandy bank wide enough for the two of us to stretch out. I dropped my axe and canteen with a thud and just stood there for a second, letting the shade wash over me. The sound of the water was the best medicine in the world right then. I knelt down, cupped my hands, and splashed my face. The cold was a shock, but a good one, washing the sweat and sawdust from my eyes. I drank deep from my hands, the water tasting of earth and stone. Jake did the same beside me, letting out a long, tired groan as he sat himself down on a mossy log. "I don't think I got a single dry thread on me," he muttered, pulling his hat off to run a hand through his soaked hair. We didn't talk much. There wasn't any need. We'd been partners for a few seasons, and you get to a point where you can just be quiet together. I sat down on the ground, my back against a big pine, and closed my eyes. I could feel the day's work in every muscle, a deep, satisfying ache. The smell was all pine needles and damp earth, and that clean, cold scent that rises off running water. It was peace, real peace. That's why the new smell hit me so hard. It came on the breeze, a subtle shift at first. I wrinkled my nose. It was a foulness, thick and sweet and rotten. Like a dead animal that's been left in the sun for a week, a real gut churner. I opened my eyes and looked at Jake. He had his head tilted, sniffing the air too, a frown on his face. "You smell that?" I asked, my voice low. He nodded slowly. "Yeah, something's dead, and it ain't been dead long." We figured it was a deer maybe, or a bear carcass somewhere upwind. It happens in the woods. Nature takes care of its own. We tried to ignore it, but the smell just seemed to get stronger, clinging to the back of my throat. It wasn't just the smell of rot. There was something else underneath it, something musky and wild, like a wet dog, but 1,000 times worse. Then we heard the rustling. It came from the other side of the creek, maybe 40, 50 feet away. The brush was thick over there, a tangled mess of young alder and devil's club. At first I thought it was a deer moving through. You hear that sound all the time, but this was different. It was heavier, slower, not the quick, light steps of a deer, but something that was pushing its way through, not caring how much noise it made. Jake and I both sat up straighter. We exchanged a look. He raised his eyebrows as if to say, "You hearing this?" I gave a slight nod. We stayed quiet, listening. The rustling stopped for a moment, then started again, closer to the bank now. I could see the tops of the alder bushes shaking. Whatever it was big. My heart started thumping a little harder against my ribs. It's a natural feeling, that prickle of alarm when you know you're not alone in the woods. You think bear. You always think bear first. I scanned the tree line, trying to pick out a shape, a patch of fur, anything. Then I saw it. Movement, a shift of shadow among the trees, something dark. My eyes strained, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It was still partly hidden by the brush, but I could tell it was massive. For a second, my brain locked onto the bear idea. It had to be a bear, a big one. But then it took another step, and the way it moved. It was all wrong. It wasn't lumbering on all fours. It was walking upright on two legs, like a man. A cold dread, completely different from the heat of the day, started to creep up my spine. I felt the hairs on my arms stand up. I couldn't look away. It came out of the trees and stopped at the edge of the creek bank, right where the brush thinned out. It was standing in plain view now, across the water from us. It was the biggest thing I'd ever seen that wasn't a barn. It had to be over 7 feet tall, easy. Its body was covered in hair, but it wasn't shaggy like a bear's. It was shorter, more like the dark, coarse hair of a horse, a deep, muddy brown color that seemed to suck in the light. Its arms were incredibly long, hanging down past its knees, and they were thick, corded with muscle I could see even from a distance. Its legs were like tree trunks, but it was the head that really stole the air from my lungs. It was set right on its broad shoulders, no real neck to speak of, and its face, it wasn't a bear's face. It was flatter, almost man-like, but not a man, not any man I'd ever want to meet. I couldn't make out fine details from 70 paces away, but I could feel its eyes on us. They were dark, set deep under a heavy brow. We were frozen. I don't think I was even breathing. The world had shrunk down to this creek, this creature, and the hammering of my own heart. The smell was overwhelming now, that rotten, musky stench pouring off it in waves. It just stood there, staring at us. It didn't make a sound. It didn't growl or huff. The silence was worse than any noise. It was a judging silence. What are you doing here? Silence. Then Jake found his voice. It wasn't a strong voice. It was a shaky, thin thing that cracked in the middle. He yelled out, "Who goes there?" The moment the words left his mouth, I wanted to reach over and clamp my hand over his face. Why did he have to go and do that? Why did he have to acknowledge it? The creature's head didn't move, but its eyes, I felt its gaze sharpen. It was like a physical pressure, that stare. It felt ancient and cold and utterly wild. It was looking right through me, into me. I felt like a mouse under the eye of a hawk. My muscles were locked. I couldn't have moved if I'd wanted to. My hand was resting on the ground, and I could feel the individual grains of sand, the cool dampness of the earth beneath my palm. I was hyper-aware of everything, the sweat trickling down my temple, the faint gurgle of the creek, the way Jake was trembling slightly beside me. The creature took a single, slow step forward. It didn't step into the water. It just shifted its weight. The movement was fluid, powerful. It wasn't clumsy. This thing knew how to use its body. Then, after what felt like an hour but was probably only a few heartbeats, it turned its head. It looked away from us, up the steep, wooded hill behind it, and then it moved. It didn't run. It walked, but its walk was like nothing I've ever seen. Its strides were immense, covering ground with a speed that didn't seem possible for something so huge. It was graceful in a terrifying way. Its long arms swung at its sides, and its powerful legs propelled it up the slope like it was nothing. It moved through the trees, between the firs and cedars, and it was just gone. The brush swallowed it up. The sound of its movement faded almost instantly. The woods were quiet again. The only sound was the creek. I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. It came out as a ragged gasp. I looked at Jake. His face was white as a sheet, his eyes wide and staring at the spot where the thing had disappeared. He looked like he'd seen a ghost. We didn't say a word. We just sat there, stunned. The fear was still there, a cold lump in my gut, but it was starting to be joined by a creeping, bewildered awe. What in God's name was that? After a few minutes, Jake slowly, carefully got to his feet. He picked up his axe, holding it tight in both hands. I did the same. The familiar weight of the tool was a small comfort. We didn't need to discuss it. We both started walking quickly back towards camp. We didn't run. Running felt like it might attract attention, but we walked as fast as we could without breaking into a jog, our heads on a swivel, scanning every shadow, listening for every snap of a twig. We got back to camp and went straight to our tent. We still didn't talk about it. What would we say? We'd seen a monster, a demon. We were both grown men, lumbermen. We were supposed to be tough. Saying it out loud felt like it would make it real in a way we couldn't take back. We went about our evening routines, building up the fire, boiling coffee, eating our beans and salt pork. But the easy silence between us was gone. It was a tense, heavy quiet. Every noise from the forest made us jump. The hoot of an owl sounded like a warning. A couple days later, an Indian named Joe came by the camp. He vended things to the lumber crews, tobacco, sometimes fresh meat, little carvings. He was a quiet man, but he knew the woods better than any of us. He was sitting by our fire, sharing a pipe, when Jake His voice, still a little unsteady, brought it up. He didn't give details. He just said, "Joe, we saw something by the creek a couple days back. Big. Walked on two legs, smelled awful." Joe was quiet for a long time, just puffing on his pipe. He looked from Jake to me, his dark eyes thoughtful. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Mountain giants," he said, his voice low and even. "My people see them sometimes. They are quiet. They walk at night. They live in the deep places." He said it so matter-of-factly, like he was talking about a type of bird or a kind of fish. There was no fear in his voice, just a simple statement of fact. "That's what that was?" I asked, my own voice barely a whisper. Joe just shrugged. "Could be. They are strong, they are old, they do not like to be seen." He took another puff from his pipe. "You were lucky. That was it." He didn't elaborate. He finished his pipe, did his trading and moved on to the next camp. But his words settled something in me. It didn't make it less terrifying, but it made it real. It had a name of sorts. It was a thing that was known, even if it wasn't known by men like me. We never spoke of it to anyone else in the camp. We knew they'd laugh, call us drunk or crazy. But between me and Jake, it was a bond, a secret knowledge that changed how we saw the world. The wilderness wasn't just trees and animals and hard work anymore. It was deeper than that. It was older. There were things in it that didn't fit in any book I'd ever read. We swore to each other right there by our tent that what we saw was the truth, every last detail. And to this day I can close my eyes and be right back on that creek bank. I can feel the sun on my neck, hear the water, and then I smell that god-awful stench. I see that dark shape moving through the trees. I feel that paralyzing gaze. I see it turn and walk away with those great swift strides, vanishing into the shadows like it was never there at all. And I know with a certainty that still chills my blood that we were not alone out there, and that the woods keep secrets we can't even begin to understand. Story 11. This happened back in the early 70s. He was a young man then, living and working on his family's farm in Tuna, Mississippi. The land was his life. He knew every inch of it, from the fields they worked to the dense woods that separated their property from Tunic Lake and Flower Lake. He and his buddy, a guy he'd known since they were kids, spent most of their free time out there fishing and hunting. They had this little wooden boat they kept tied up in a secluded inlet on Tunic Lake. It wasn't much, just a flat-bottomed John boat, but it was theirs. There'd been a solid stretch of rain, like 3 or 4 days of it just coming down steady. The kind of rain that turns dirt roads to soup and makes the woods feel heavy and wet. The day it finally cleared, the sky was still a pale, washed-out gray, and everything was dripping. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and pine. My grandpa and his friend decided they needed to go check on the boat. They were worried the rain might have swelled the creek that fed the inlet, or that a branch might have come down on it. They walked the familiar path, their boots sinking into the soft ground. The woods were quiet. Not a peaceful quiet, but the kind of quiet that feels like it's holding its breath. All you could hear was the squelch of their steps and the occasional plop of water falling from a leaf high up in the canopy. It was the middle of the afternoon, but under the trees it felt later, dimmer. When they got to the inlet, they saw it right away. The boat was tipped over, not just leaning, but completely upside down, half in the water, half on the muddy bank. Their gear was scattered everywhere. An old coffee can full of worms was on its side, the dirt spilling out. A tackle box was open, its little trays empty, the hooks and lures gone. My grandpa's first thought was kids, maybe, or some animal had gotten into it, but it felt wrong. The boat was heavy. It would have taken a lot to flip it like that. His friend pointed. The bait bucket's gone. It was a metal bucket, the kind with a handle. They used it to keep their catch alive, and his friend's favorite fishing pole, a decent casting rod, was missing too. That's when the first real prickle went up my grandpa's neck. An animal might knock stuff around, but it wouldn't carry off a metal bucket and a fishing pole. They started looking around the immediate area, their eyes scanning the muddy ground. The mud was a mess of their own boot prints from previous trips. But there was something else. It was hard to make out, just deep, rounded depressions. They weren't clear prints, not like a deer or a dog. They were just deep holes, like something really heavy had been standing there. My grandpa told me he remembers feeling a sudden, stupid need to get his bait bucket back. It was a feeling of violation, I think. Someone, or something, had been at their spot. They decided to follow the tree line, thinking maybe whatever it was had just dragged the stuff into the woods and dropped it. The underbrush was thick, wet ferns and thorny vines snagging at their jeans. They were calling out, "Hello!" half expecting to scare off a raccoon or something, but there was no answer, no rustle, just that heavy, wet silence. They pushed a little deeper, maybe 20, 30 feet in, where the light was real poor. That's when they heard it. It wasn't a twig snap. It was a loud, sharp crack, like a decent-sized branch had just been broken in two, not stepped on, but broken. The sound was so sudden and so violent in that quiet, it froze both of them in their tracks. They turned toward the sound, and that's when they saw it. It was back in the shadows, maybe 50 feet away, standing between two big pine trees. It wasn't standing all the way up like a man, but it wasn't on all fours like a bear either. It was slouching, its shoulders hunched up high, with this powerful, heavy look to its upper body. Its legs seemed a little shorter in proportion. The color was dark, a wet, muddy, brownish gray, like the bark of a water oak. It was big. My grandpa said later he figured it was at least 7 feet tall if it stood up straight, and broad. Really broad. But it was the way it moved that made his stomach drop. It took a step, and it wasn't a graceful step. It was a heavy, deliberate, rolling kind of motion, like its weight was a burden it had to shift. And then it stopped and turned its head toward them. He couldn't see its face clearly at first, just a darker patch in the shadow of its body. But then it took another one of those heavy, slouching steps toward them, coming out of the deepest shadows just enough. The features were all wrong. The face was kind of flat, with a heavy brow that shadowed its eyes. The mouth. He said the mouth was the worst part, even before it made a sound. It was wide, and the lips seemed too prominent, almost like a gorilla's. But different. My grandpa said his brain was screaming, "Bear! It's a bear!" But he knew, right in that moment, he knew it wasn't. The proportions were all wrong. The way it held itself was all wrong. It didn't move with a bear's curious lumber. This was something else, something he had no name for. Then the terror moment hit, just like he told me. The thing locked eyes with him. He said its eyes were a light, almost yellowish color, and they held an intelligence that was absolutely chilling. It wasn't the blank stare of a deer or the simple aggression of a predator. This was a looking, a knowing. It was looking right into him. And then it rolled its head. Not a shake, but a slow, deliberate roll of its head on its massive shoulders, like a man working out a crick in his neck. The movement was so unnervingly casual, so human-like, but on that completely non-human body. As it did this, its lips curled back. It wasn't a snarl, not exactly. It was a slow, deliberate pulling back of those thick lips, revealing dark gums and teeth that were thick and blocky. And then the sound came out. It started as a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate right in my grandpa's chest, but layered over the top of it was this loud, sharp hiss. He said it was the exact sound an alligator makes when it's warning you off. That powerful, airy hiss, but coming from a thing that was standing on 2 legs. The combination was paralyzing, the growl and the hiss together, and as it made this sound, its chest expanded, puffing out, making it look even bigger, more powerful. That sound, that sight, it just short-circuited something in him. All the air left his lungs, his legs turned to water. He took a stumbling step backward, his eyes still locked on this thing, and his heel caught on a big, exposed cypress root behind him. He went down hard, flat on his back in the wet leaves and mud. The fall knocked the wind out of him, and for a second, the world was just a grey sky through tree branches and the crushing weight of pure fear. He couldn't breathe, couldn't move. His friend was shouting his name, but it sounded distant, like he was at the end of a long tunnel. His friend grabbed him by the arm, hauling him up onto his feet. My grandpa's legs were still like jelly, and he clung to his friend's jacket just to stay upright. As he got his feet under him, he looked back to where the thing had been. It was gone, just gone. The space between the two pine trees was empty. Then they heard it. A tremendous crashing sound, like a tractor plowing through the underbrush. It wasn't the light, skittering run of a deer. This was a heavy, powerful, brutal movement. They could hear branches snapping, saplings being shoved aside, the sound moving away from them at an incredible speed, getting fainter but still loud, heading deeper into the swampy land toward Flower Lake. That's when my grandpa's training, his instinct from a lifetime of hunting, kicked in. He always carried a .22 revolver, a little six-shooter on his hip when he was out in the woods, mostly for snakes. His hand went to it without him even thinking, fumbling with the leather strap on the holster. He pulled it out, his hand shaking so bad he could barely aim. He didn't even really look. He just pointed it in the general direction of the crashing sound, which was already fading, and he fired. Just one shot. The crack of the little gun was pitifully small against the memory of that crashing sound and the creature's hissing growl. The shot seemed to break the spell. They both turned and ran. They didn't say a word to each other. They just ran, crashing through the brush themselves now, not caring about thorns or branches, their lungs burning, their hearts hammering against their ribs. They didn't stop running until they burst out of the tree line and into the open field behind his family's barn. They stood there, bent over, hands on their knees, gasping for air. The safe, familiar sight of the farmhouse in the distance not making them feel any better. They didn't tell anyone that night. What would they say? They were two grown men, both known for being level-headed. Who would believe them? They just went inside, cleaned up, and tried to act normal, but my grandpa said he couldn't eat. He just sat in his room, staring at the wall, seeing those yellowish eyes every time he closed his own. The next day, in the bright, clear light of a sunny morning, they went back. They brought rifles this time, a .30-30 and a .308. The woods looked different in the daylight, ordinary. They found their way back to the spot. The boat was still overturned. Their gear was still scattered. They went to the place where they'd seen it. The ground was too torn up from their own panicked flight to make out much, but they looked at the trees. On several of the pines, about 7 or 8 feet off the ground, they found deep marks. They weren't scratches or claw marks. They were more like impressions, like something very strong had gripped the tree and just pressed into the bark, hard enough to leave a permanent dent and peel long strips of bark away. The bark wasn't shredded. It was peeled, like you'd peel a banana, in long curls hanging down. My grandpa said it looked like the work of something with immense hand strength, not claws. There were no claw marks anywhere. They searched for a long time but never found the bait bucket or the fishing pole. My grandpa never went back into those deep woods alone again. He'd hunt near the fields, but he never again felt that easy comfort in the forest. He told me this story when I was a teenager, when he saw I was getting interested in hiking and camping. He looked me dead in the eye and said, "You stay out of those deep woods around the lakes. You hear me? That thing wasn't alone. I felt it. There are more of them, and they aren't animals you understand." He carried that fear with him for the rest of his life. It wasn't a fear of the dark or of ghosts. It was a specific, grounded fear of a place, of a thing he saw on a wet afternoon in the early 70s, a thing that looked at him, that knew he was there, and that made a sound he could still hear in his dreams 50 years later. He died with that story, and with the absolute, unshakable certainty that there are things in this world we don't know, things that live in the quiet, wet places just out of sight, and sometimes, if you're unlucky, they look back. Story 12. We depacked some snacks and hot coffee in a thermos, and I was driving my old pickup truck, a beat-up Ford that had seen better days. But it was reliable. The roads were mostly empty that night, just us and the occasional set of tire tracks in the snow. We found this little pull-off area, just a wide spot in the road where you could stop and look out over the valley. It was surrounded by dense woods on one side and a steep slope on the other, all covered in a fresh layer of snow that glittered under the moon. We parked, killed the engine, and just sat there for a while, talking quietly and sipping our coffee. The silence was intense, the kind where you can hear your own heartbeat if you listen close enough. Everything felt peaceful at first. The air was so cold, it made my lungs ache a little when I breathed in, but in a good way, like it was cleaning me out. My friend was bundled up in a thick coat, and I had on my heavy jacket, but we still had the heater running low to keep the cab warm. We were laughing about some stupid thing from school, and I remember feeling really content, like this was exactly where I was supposed to be. Then, out of nowhere, we saw this large, wild boar rooting around in the snow about 50 yards away. It was big, probably 200 pounds or so, with dark, bristly fur and those mean-looking tusks. We both fell silent, just watching it. I'd seen boars before in these parts, but never this close, and never in the middle of the night like this. The boar was digging at the snow, probably looking for roots or something, and it seemed totally unaware of us. But then, all of a sudden, it froze. Its head shot up, and it let out this sharp snort like it had been spooked. Before I could even process what was happening, it bolted straight up the steep slope to our left, scrambling through the snow like its life depended on it. I remember thinking that was weird because boars aren't usually that skittish unless there's a predator around. Maybe a coyote or a bear, I thought. But the way it ran, it was pure panic. We just sat there for a minute, staring at the spot where the boar had been. The woods were dead quiet again, but it felt different now, heavier. My friend nudged me and whispered, "What do you think scared it?" I shrugged, trying to play it cool, but I could feel this knot tightening in my stomach. We kept our eyes on the trees, half expecting to see something emerge. And then we did. It was maybe a couple of minutes later when I spotted movement from the corner of my eye. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, or maybe the wind stirring the branches, but then it stepped out from between two tall pines. This figure moving on two legs. It was huge, way bigger than a man, and it walked with this effortless grace, like the steep slope was nothing. Its arms swung freely at its sides, and it didn't hunch over like a bear would. It was upright, almost human-like, but not quite. The moonlight caught its shape, and I could see it was covered in dark, shaggy hair, but it moved too smoothly to be any animal I knew. My heart started hammering in my chest. I leaned forward, squinting, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. My friend grabbed my arm, her fingers digging in, and she whispered, "Is that a person?" But I knew it wasn't. People don't move like that, not in the middle of nowhere, in the dead of winter without any gear. And it was too big, too powerful looking. It kept walking uphill, not even glancing our way, like we weren't even there. I felt this cold dread seeping into me, worse than the winter chill. My mouth went dry, and I could hear my own breathing, shallow and quick. I don't know what possessed me to do it, but I reached for the keys and turned on the truck's high beams. The light flooded the slope, and for a split second, everything was blindingly bright. The figure stopped dead in its tracks. It turned its head toward us, and that's when I saw its face, or what I could make of it. The light hit it full on, and it raised one arm to shield its eyes, like it was annoyed by the brightness. But its eyes, they glowed this amber-red color, like hot coals, and they seemed to lock right onto me. I'll never forget that look. Its expression shifted from whatever it was before to pure anger. It was like we'd disturbed something ancient, something that didn't want to be seen. Then it let out this deep, guttural grunt that vibrated through the truck cab. I felt it in my bones, this low rumble that made the hair on my arms stand up. It dropped its arm and started moving toward us, not running but walking with purpose, each step covering ground way faster than it should have. I could see its muscles rippling under that dark fur, and it was headed straight for the truck. Panic seized me. I didn't think. I just slammed my hand down on the horn. The blare of the horn cut through the silence, sharp and deafening. The figure jerked back, like it had been struck, and let out another grunt, this one higher pitched, almost a screech. Then it turned and bounded up the slope in 3 massive steps. I'm not exaggerating, 3 steps, and it was already 20 feet up. As it went, it grabbed onto a young sapling, and the thing snapped like a twig under its weight. The sound of that crack echoed in the quiet, and then it was gone, vanished into the trees. For a second, we just sat there, stunned. Then the smell hit us. It was overwhelming, this foul stench that filled the cab in an instant. It smelled like a mix of urine, sweat, and wet animal hide, so strong it made my eyes water. I started coughing, and my friend was gagging next to me. I fumbled for the window controls, but my hands were shaking so bad I could barely press the button. When I got the window down, the cold air rushed in, but the smell lingered, clinging to everything. That's when I noticed my friend was crying silently, and then I saw the dark patch spreading on her jeans. She'd wet herself. She was so terrified. I'd never seen anyone that scared before, and it just drove home how real this was. I reached over and put a hand on her shoulder, but she flinched away, her eyes wide and fixed on the spot where the thing had disappeared. "We need to go," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Now." I didn't need telling twice. I turned the key, and the engine roared to life. I'd never been so glad to hear that sound. I threw the truck into drive and peeled out of there, the tires skidding on the snow. I didn't look back, not once, just focused on the road ahead, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. The whole drive back, neither of us said a word. The only sounds were the hum of the engine and our ragged breathing. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those amber-red eyes following us, but there was nothing but darkness. When we finally got back to town, we pulled into a well-lit gas station and just sat there for what felt like hours. My friend was still shaking, and I felt numb, like I'd been hollowed out. We tried to talk about what happened, but the words wouldn't come. How do you describe something like that? It wasn't a bear, it wasn't a man, it was something else, something that shouldn't exist. We ended up driving to her place and staying up all night, too scared to sleep. Every little noise made us jump, and that smell seemed to follow us, stuck in our clothes and hair. The next morning, when the sun came up, I knew I had to go back. I don't know why. Maybe to prove to myself that it wasn't a dream, or maybe just to see if there was any evidence. My friend didn't want to come, and I didn't blame her. So I went alone, driving back to that pull-off with my heart in my throat. The place looked different in the daylight, less menacing but still isolated. I got out of the truck and walked over to where we'd seen the thing. The snow was trampled in spots, and I found these deep impressions like footprints, but they were huge, way bigger than any human foot, and they sank deep into the snow. They led up the slope to where the sapling had been broken. I found it lying on the ground, snapped clean in half, the wood fresh and white where it had broken. I looked around for more signs, tracks, hair, anything, but there was nothing else. No droppings, no other marks, just those impressions and the broken tree. It was like whatever it was had vanished into thin air. I stood there for a long time, just staring at that sapling, feeling this cold dread all over again. Part of me wanted to take pictures or something, but I didn't have a camera, and even if I did, what would I say? That I'd seen some kind of monster? Nobody would believe me. So I got back in my truck and drove away, and I never went back to that spot again. For years, I didn't tell anyone about what happened. My friend and I barely spoke of it after that night. It was like this unspoken agreement to pretend it never happened. But it changed me. I started having nightmares, waking up in a cold sweat, smelling that stench all over again. I became jumpy, especially in the woods or at night. It wasn't until a few years ago when I met someone at a camping trip who mentioned a similar experience in the same area that I finally opened up. Hearing his story made me feel less alone, but it didn't make the fear go away. To this day, I still don't know what we saw that night. Was it Bigfoot? Some kind of unknown animal? I have no explanation, and that's what haunts me the most. The memory is as vivid as if it happened yesterday, and sometimes when I'm alone in the dark, I can still see those amber-red eyes staring back at me, full of anger, and I remember how small and helpless I felt. It's something I'll carry with me for the rest of my life, this gap in my understanding of the world, and I doubt I'll ever find closure. Story 13. Okay, I'll never forget this. It was one of those days that starts out perfect and ends with you feeling like you're never going to feel safe in the woods again. My buddy and I, we go way back. We've been hunting together since we were teenagers. This was a few years ago, late October. The air had that crisp bite to it, the kind that makes you feel alive. We were bow hunting for black-tailed deer along the North Fork of the Siaslaw River in Oregon. It's our spot, or it was. I don't think I can ever go back there now. We'd parked the truck off a logging road so overgrown it was barely a path, and we hiked in about an hour before first light. The plan was to split up, find a good vantage point overlooking some game trails, and meet back at the truck a couple hours after sunset. Standard stuff. I found my spot near a small, gurgling creek. It was a good place, a natural funnel between a steep, timbered hillside and a thicket of salmonberry so dense you'd need a machete to get through. I settled my back against a big old cedar, its roots snaking over the ground, and just waited. The forest was waking up. Birds were chirping. A squirrel was chattering somewhere above me. It was peaceful, for a little while anyway. The first thing that felt off was the silence. It didn't happen all at once. It was like someone was slowly turning a volume knob down. The birds just stopped. The squirrels shut up. The woods got quiet. The kind of quiet that feels heavy, like a blanket smothering everything. I remember thinking it was weird, but you know, it happens. Maybe a coyote passed through or something. I shrugged it off and scanned the trees, my bow resting across my lap. Then I heard the first knock. It wasn't a loud one. It came from across the creek, up on the hillside, a single solid thump, like someone had taken a big branch and smacked it against a tree trunk. It was sharp, it carried. My first thought was, stupidly, another hunter. But that made no sense. Who would be whacking a tree? And it didn't sound like a gunshot or anything man-made. It was just a knock. I sat up a little straighter, my senses prickling. I peered into the timber, but from my position, everything was just a wall of green and brown shadows. I couldn't see a thing. A few minutes passed, nothing. The silence was still there, pressing in. I was starting to feel a little stupid for getting spooked. Then it came again, thump, from the same general area. Then another, a few seconds later. Thump. It wasn't random, it was rhythmic. Thump, thump, thump. 3 knocks, spaced evenly apart. My heart started beating a little faster. This wasn't right. This wasn't an animal. A deer might thump its hoof, but this was higher up and heavier. A bear. Maybe a bear scratching its back on a tree, but it didn't sound like scratching. It was too clean, too intentional. It sounded like a signal. I held my breath, listening so hard my ears started to ring with the strain. The knocks stopped. For about 10 minutes, there was nothing but that awful, suffocating silence. I was about to relax, to chalk it up to some weird forest quirk, when I heard the rustling. It wasn't the light skittering of a squirrel or a bird. This was heavy. It was the sound of something big moving through the salmonberry thicket on my side of the creek, the one I thought was impenetrable. It was close, maybe 50 yards away, if that. I could hear branches snapping, not little twigs, but thick, woody ones, and it was moving slow, deliberate, not crashing through in a panic, but stepping carefully. like it was trying to be quiet, but was just too damn big to manage it. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead. My hands, which had been resting on my bow, were now clenched tight around it. I slowly, so slowly it felt like my joints were creaking, shifted my position. I pressed myself flatter against the cedar tree, trying to make myself small. My camouflage felt useless. Whatever was out there knew exactly where I was. I could feel it. The rustling stopped. It had moved parallel to me, and then it just ceased. It was listening. I was sure of it. We were both frozen, listening for each other in the quiet. My mind was racing. It had to be a bear, a big one, a rogue elk. But elk don't knock on trees, and they usually travel in groups. This felt solitary, predatory. The stories you hear around campfires started bubbling up in my head, the ones you laugh off with a beer in your hand. Sasquatch, Bigfoot. I shoved the thought away. That was crazy. That was for kids and weirdos on the internet. But the knocking, the deliberate, heavy movement, it didn't fit any animal I knew. Then the knocks started again, and this time they were closer. A lot closer. They came from the edge of the thicket, right where the rustling had stopped. Thump, thump, thump. The force behind them was different. They weren't just noises. They were impacts. I could feel the vibrations through the ground. Each one hit me in the chest. This wasn't across the creek anymore. This thing, whatever it was, had closed the distance without me hearing a damn thing after that initial rustle. How does something that big move so quietly? My breath was coming in short, shallow gasps. I was terrified to make a sound. I remember the feeling of the rough bark of the cedar against my back, the dampness of the moss seeping through my pants. I could smell my own fear, a sharp metallic smell. My mouth was dry as dust. I had my bow, but it felt like a toy. What was I gonna do? Shoot an arrow at a sound? The knock stopped. Another stretch of silence, but this one was different. It was a waiting silence, a predatory silence. I didn't move a muscle. I just stared into the wall of brush, my eyes straining to see anything, a shape, a shadow, anything. And then I saw it. Movement. A shift in the pattern of shadows deep within the thicket. Something dark, much darker than the surrounding foliage. It was tall, impossibly tall. It was just a glimpse, a vertical shape that blotted out the light for a second, and then it was gone. But it was enough. My brain finally accepted what my gut had known for a while. This was no bear. That's when the terror moment hit, the one that's burned into my memory. A single, deafening crack exploded from maybe 30 feet away, from a big hemlock tree right on the edge of the clearing. It was so loud, so sudden. It was like a gunshot right next to my ear. It wasn't a knock anymore. It was a blow. It sounded like the tree itself had split. I literally jumped, my whole body seizing up. Every hair on my arms and on the back of my neck stood straight up. A cold jolt, like an electric shock, shot down my spine. I froze, completely, utterly frozen. I wasn't breathing, I wasn't thinking, I was just pure animal fear. I stared at that hemlock, my eyes wide, expecting to see something, anything step out from behind it, but there was nothing, just the quiet, undisturbed forest. The sound had been so close, so physical, that the absence of a source was somehow more terrifying than seeing a monster would have been. My mind was screaming. What was that? What could hit a tree that hard? It wasn't a falling branch. It was a strike, a powerful, focused strike. The silence that followed was the most profound thing I have ever experienced. It was a void. It felt like the whole forest was holding its breath with me. I don't know how long I sat there, paralyzed. It could have been 10 seconds. It could have been 10 minutes. Time just stopped. Slowly, painfully, I forced myself to move. My muscles were stiff with adrenaline. I had to get out of there. I had to find my partner. I started gathering my gear, my movements jerky and rushed. I didn't care about noise anymore. I just needed to be gone. As I stood up, my legs feeling like jelly, I heard it one more time, a single, softer thump from back in the thicket. It wasn't a threat this time. It felt like an acknowledgement, a goodbye, or a "I'm still here." I practically ran through the woods, crashing through ferns and over logs, not even trying to be quiet. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it would burst. I was sweating and cold at the same time. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see some huge, dark figure keeping pace with me just inside the tree line. I've never felt so watched, so hunted in my entire life. I found my partner back at the truck. He was already there, packing his gear, and he looked pale. He saw my face and just nodded. "You heard it too," he said, his voice tight. It wasn't a question. He told me he'd been set up about half a mile away, and he'd heard the same thing. Rhythmic knocks that got closer. He said he'd heard something big moving through the brush near him, and then a loud crack that made him pack up and leave immediately. He said the same thing I felt, that whatever it was playing with us. It knew where we were, and it was letting us know it was there. We didn't talk much after that. We just threw our gear in the back of the truck, got in, and locked the doors. As we drove down that bumpy logging road, the headlights cutting through the deepening twilight, I kept my eyes glued to the woods. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed, that something was moving just outside the beam of the headlights, keeping pace with the truck. We didn't stop until we hit the paved highway, and even then we both kept checking the rearview mirror. We never went back to that spot. We tried to rationalize it for a while. A particularly clever bear? A couple of loggers playing a prank? But it doesn't fit. The location was too remote, the behavior was too bizarre, the intelligence behind it was too palpable. It felt old, and it felt like it owned those woods. To this day, if I even think about it too much, I get that same cold chill down my spine. I can still hear that final shattering crack echoing in my head. I never saw what it was. I just saw a shadow, felt its presence, and heard its voice in the knocks on the wood. And that's somehow worse, because my mind can fill in the blank with something far more terrifying than anything I could have actually seen. I know what I believe it was, but I'll never say it out loud. Some things are better left in the woods. Story 14. I've been putting off writing this down for a long time, mostly because just thinking about it makes my hands shake even now, months later. But I keep seeing stories on here that sound a little like what happened to us, and I guess I need to get it out. Maybe someone will read it and believe me, or at least understand why I haven't been able to sleep right since. It was late September, and me and two of my buddies, let's just call them my friends, since names don't really matter here, decided to go on a fishing and scouting trip up in the Mount Hood National Forest in Oregon. We do this every year, just a guy's weekend to get away from everything. This time, though, we had something extra with us. My buddy is a biology student, and he talked us into helping him with this scavenger experiment for one of his projects. Basically, we had this 55-gallon drum in the back of my truck full of animal remains. He'd gotten them from a butcher, just scraps, bones, some offal, that kind of thing. The plan was to set it out away from camp and see what came to it. Document the scavenger activity. I thought it was kind of gross, but he was passionate about it, so whatever. We got to our usual spot, a clearing we've used before, deep in the forest off one of the less traveled service roads. It was already getting dark by the time we finished setting up the tents and got a fire going. The air had that crisp, cold bite to it that tells you summer's really over. Everything felt normal at first. The smell of pine, the crackle of the fire, the usual sounds of the woods settling in for the night. We cooked some hot dogs, had a few beers, talked about nothing important. It was good. It felt safe. The first thing that felt off was the silence. Around maybe 10 o'clock, the usual nighttime noises just stopped. No crickets, no distant owls, nothing. We didn't think much of it at first, just figured it was the cold. Then, from a ridge maybe 300 yards away, we heard this scream. It wasn't an owl. I've heard barred owls. They sound like monkeys. It's weird, but you get used to it. This wasn't that. It wasn't a cougar either. I've spent a lot of time in these woods. I know what a cougar sounds like. It's a terrifying sound, like a woman being murdered. This was different. This was lower, guttural, but it also had this high, piercing edge to it that felt like it was drilling right into my skull. It was a gut-wrenching scream, the kind that makes the hair on your arms stand up instantly. It wasn't just loud. It felt intelligent, like it was being directed at us. We all just froze by the fire. My one friend, the quieter one, he just looked at me, his eyes wide. He didn't say anything. None of us did. We just listened. It screamed again, a long, drawn-out sound that echoed through the valley. It felt like it lasted for a full minute. The fire didn't feel warm anymore. The woods around us, which had felt so familiar just minutes before, suddenly felt like a completely different place. A place where we weren't supposed to be. We tried to brush it off. Weird elk, someone mumbled. But it wasn't an elk. We all knew it. We just didn't want to say what we were really thinking. We sat by the fire for another hour or so, but the mood was dead. We were all just listening, straining our ears for any other sound. The normal sounds never came back. It was just us, the fire, and this heavy, watchful silence. We decided to turn in. I remember crawling into my sleeping bag and just lying there, fully clothed, my heart still thumping. I could hear my friends in the other tent whispering. I couldn't make out the words, but I could hear the tension in their voices. I must have fallen asleep at some point, because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake. It was pitch black. The kind of dark you only get in the deep woods, where you can't even see your hand in front of your face. My watch said it was 3:30 in the morning. I was awake because I heard footsteps. They were heavy, not like a deer or even a bear. This was a slow, deliberate thump, thump, thump. It was bipedal. I know what two-legged walking sounds like. This was something walking on two legs, and it was big. Each step had a weight to it that made the ground feel solid, like it was absorbing the impact. It was close, not right on top of us, but maybe 30, 40 feet from the tents, just outside the ring of firelight we'd had hours before. I held my breath. I could feel my whole body tensed up, my fingers gripping the fabric of my sleeping bag. I just lay there, frozen, listening to it walk. It wasn't circling the camp, it was just pacing, back and forth along a line parallel to our tents. Thump, thump, then a pause, then it would start again. Then came the knocks, 3 of them, sharp, distinct, percussive cracks. It sounded like someone had taken a giant branch and smashed it against a solid tree trunk. Crack, crack, crack. The sound was so loud it felt like it was right next to my ear. It wasn't a tree falling. It wasn't a branch snapping in the wind. This was something hitting wood against wood with immense force. 3 perfect, spaced-out knocks. It was a signal. It had to be. Right after the 3rd knock, I heard the zipper on my friend's tent slide open just a tiny bit. Then my friend's voice, a strained, terrified whisper that cut through the silence. "Do you hear that?" I didn't answer. I didn't have to. We all heard it. The footsteps had stopped after the knocks. Now the silence was back, but it was 1,000 times worse. It was the silence of something waiting, something listening back to us. We stayed like that for what felt like an hour. No one moved. No one spoke. I don't think any of us even breathed normally. We were just waiting for something to happen, for the footsteps to start again, for the thing to rip through the thin nylon of our tent. But nothing happened. Eventually, the first hints of dawn started to lighten the sky from pure black to a deep, gloomy grey. The forest began to wake up with its normal, faint sounds. Birds started chirping tentatively. It was only then that I finally let out the breath I felt like I'd been holding all night. My muscles ached from being clenched for so long. I slowly, carefully unzipped my tent and crawled out. The air was cold and damp. My two friends emerged from their tent at the same time. They looked like hell, pale, wide-eyed, like they'd aged 10 years in one night. We didn't say a word. We just looked at each other, and that was all the conversation we needed. We'd all heard it. We were all terrified. We started moving around, trying to act normal, to make coffee on the camp stove. Our hands were shaking. That's when my friend pointed at the plastic camp table. We had one of those cheap, white, fold-up plastic tables. It was sitting where we'd left it, next to the cold fire pit. On the edge of the table there was a bite mark. It wasn't a scratch or a claw mark. It was a bite, a huge one. It looked like something had just leaned down and taken a single, deliberate chomp out of the hard plastic. The plastic was cracked and splintered inward, with clear impressions of what looked like teeth. Big teeth. The bite was deep, at least an inch into the thick plastic lip of the table. It wasn't random gnawing. It was one solid bite, like a statement. I've seen what bears do. They'll claw at coolers, they'll maul a table if there's food residue, but they don't take one single, clean, powerful bite out of solid plastic for no reason. There was no food on that table. Nothing had been spilled. It was just a bite. A "I was here" bite. That's when the real dread started to set in, deeper than the fear from the night. This wasn't just some random animal passing through. This thing had come into our camp while we were sleeping, right up to our table, and done this. It had been inches from our tents. We all looked at each other again, and without a single word being said, we all knew we were leaving. Now. The fishing trip was over. The scavenger experiment was over. We just wanted to get the hell out of there. We started packing up in a frantic, silent hurry, just throwing everything into the truck, not even bothering to fold things properly. My buddy with the biology project looked sick. He gestured to the drum in the back of my truck. "We can't just leave this here," he whispered. He was right. The last thing we wanted was to leave a drum full of rotting meat right next to our campsite, especially now. So we decided to dump it. We drove my truck about a mile down the service road to a wide turnout that overlooked a steep ravine. It was a place people sometimes used to dump yard waste or whatever. We were going to just roll the drum out and let it spill down the hill. It was still early. The sun wasn't fully up yet, and the fog was clinging to the trees. It was eerie and quiet. Getting that drum out of the truck was a nightmare. It was heavy and sloshing, and the smell was foul. We wrestled it to the tailgate and just shoved it over. It landed with a heavy thud on the gravel, and we rolled it to the edge of the ravine. We didn't even bother opening it. We just tipped the whole thing over. It crashed down through the undergrowth, and we heard it finally come to a stop somewhere below. The sound of metal buckling. We didn't wait to see anything else. We jumped back in the truck and sped back to camp to grab the last of our stuff. The whole drive back, maybe 10 minutes, we were all just staring out the windows, scanning the trees. The feeling of being watched was so intense, it was like a physical pressure. It was the same feeling you get when you know someone is standing right behind you, but this was coming from all directions, from the deep shadows between the trees. We pulled back into our campsite, the tires crunching on the gravel and pine needles, and we all saw it at the same time. The drum was gone. Not just tipped over, not just opened. Gone. We had just dumped it. We were gone for maybe 15-20 minutes tops. We got out of the truck and just stood there, staring at the spot where we'd left it. There was nothing. No drum, no trail of gore, no drag marks in the damp earth or gravel, nothing. I walked over to the edge of the ravine, my heart hammering against my ribs. I looked down. I could see the path the drum had taken when it fell, a swath of broken ferns and disturbed dirt. But the drum wasn't at the bottom. It was just gone. And then I smelled it, a smell I'll never forget. It was musky, thick, like a wet dog. but mixed with something else, something wild and pungent like old compost and damp earth. It was overwhelming, and it was right there, hanging in the air where the drum had been. That's what did it for me. The screams in the night, the footsteps, the wood knocks, the bite mark on the table. I could have tried to explain each of those away somehow. But this, a several hundred-pound metal drum full of rotting meat, vanished into thin air in less than 20 minutes, with no drag marks, no sign of a struggle, nothing. Just gone, replaced by that awful, intelligent smell. We didn't say a word. We just threw the last of our gear in the truck, jumped in, and I peeled out of there. We didn't stop until we hit a gas station with cell service an hour later. I've turned it over in my head 1,000,000 times. A bear couldn't have done that. A cougar couldn't have. A person wouldn't have. There's only one thing that fits, and it's the thing you're not supposed to believe in. Something big, something strong, and something smart enough to not only take the drum, but to clean up after itself. It knew we had the remains. It followed us. It investigated our camp. It signaled in the night, and then it took what it wanted silently and completely, leaving us with nothing but a memory and a smell that still haunts me. I don't go camping anymore. I look at the woods differently now. I know what's out there, and I know that it knows we were there too. Story 15. I've never been someone who believed in monsters. Not really, anyway. Ghost stories were fun around a campfire, but out here, just outside Omaha, life was pretty normal. Or at least it seemed that way until I was 10 years old. That's when I first realized something wasn't right. It wasn't a single huge event, not at first, but more like a slow, creeping dread that settled over our property and never really left. My sister and I were playing in the backyard on a double tire swing my dad had hung from the big oak tree. It was a warm afternoon, the kind where the air feels thick and lazy. We'd been swinging for a while, taking turns pushing each other, laughing about nothing important. Then, out of nowhere, my sister just stopped. Her laughter cut off like someone had flipped a switch. I remember the swing slowing down, the creak of the ropes, and her staring past me toward the tree line that separated our yard from the gully behind our house. Her face went pale, I mean really pale, like she'd seen a ghost. Before I could ask what was wrong, she let out this short, sharp scream, not loud, but scared, real scared, and she jumped off the swing, stumbling as she hit the ground. She didn't even look back at me, just ran full tilt toward the house, her feet pounding on the grass. I was confused, sure, but mostly I was annoyed. I thought she was messing around, trying to scare me. I hopped off the swing and followed her inside, calling her name, asking what her problem was. She was already in the kitchen, clinging to our mom, shaking and crying too hard to talk properly. All she could get out was that she'd seen something big and hairy near the trees. Mom tried to calm her down, saying it was probably a dog or a deer, but my sister kept insisting it wasn't. It was standing up, she said. It was tall. My dad, being the kind of guy who doesn't spook easy, went outside to look. He was gone for maybe 10 minutes. When he came back, his expression was serious. He didn't say much, just told us to stay away from the gully for a while. Later, I overheard him talking to Mom in the living room. He'd found footprints, massive ones, he said, bigger than any man's, leading straight into the gully. That was the first time I felt that cold knot in my stomach, the first hint that maybe my sister hadn't just imagined things. Years went by. I hit my early teens and mostly life went on. I'd hear things sometimes at night, cracks and rustles from the gully, but I tried to brush it off. Then one afternoon when I was about 13, I saw it myself. I was walking up our driveway after getting the mail. The driveway's long gravel crunching under my shoes, and it curves around a patch of trees before you reach the house. I was just walking, not really paying attention, when movement caught my eye. Something was crossing the driveway, maybe 50 yards ahead, coming from the left and heading toward the gully on the right. At first I thought it was a person, a really tall person, maybe wearing a dark coat. but then I registered the way it moved. It was walking upright, but its legs were kind of bow-legged, and its shoulders swung in a heavy, deliberate way. Its whole body was covered in shaggy, dark hair, like a bear, but it wasn't a bear. Bears don't walk like that. They don't have that smooth, purposeful gait. This thing did. It crossed the driveway in a few strides and disappeared into the trees on the other side. The whole sighting lasted maybe 3 seconds. I stood there, frozen, the mail gripped tight in my hand. My heart was hammering in my chest. I didn't tell anyone for a long time. What was I supposed to say? I saw a big, hairy man in the woods. They'd think I was crazy, but that was nothing compared to what happened in April of 2002. I was 17 by then. That's the encounter that still haunts me, the one that made me afraid of my own backyard. It was a Tuesday night, late, probably after 11. I was up in my room reading, and the dog started whining to go out. We had 2 labs, Buddy and Duke, and they were usually pretty calm. I went downstairs, my bare feet cold on the linoleum floor, and opened the back door. They shot out into the yard, their tags jingling. For a second, everything was quiet. Just the normal night sounds, crickets, the faint rustle of leaves. Then both dogs started barking, not their usual, hey, a squirrel bark. This was frantic, scared barking, the kind that makes the hair on your arms stand up. I stepped out onto the back porch, the wood rough under my feet. "Buddy, Duke, knock it off," I called. They weren't listening. They were at the far end of the yard, near the chain-link fence that separates our property from the gully. They were staring into the darkness, barking their heads off, their bodies tense. I squinted, trying to see what had them so spooked. The moon was out, casting a little light, but the tree line was a wall of shadows. Then I saw it. Behind one of the thicker trees, maybe 30 feet from the fence, was a figure. It was tall. So tall its head was level with the lower branches. It was just standing there, perfectly still, half hidden by the trunk. But I could see enough. It was dark, covered in what looked like shaggy, blackish-brown hair, and it was watching me. I felt it. That feeling of being stared at, of being the center of something's attention, is a physical weight. My breath caught in my throat. The dogs must have sensed it too. Their barking turned to these high-pitched yelps of pure fear. Then, as one, they turned and bolted for the house. They didn't just run, they scrambled, skidding on the grass, desperate to get away. They shot past me into the house without a backward glance. I was alone, just me and this thing in the dark. My feet felt glued to the porch. I couldn't move, I couldn't even blink. I was just staring at that dark shape behind the tree, and it was staring back. Then it moved. It didn't step out from behind the tree. It leaped. One moment it was behind one tree, and the next it was gliding to another one about 15 feet away. There was no clumsy crash, no stumbling. It was smooth, almost fluid, like it weighed nothing. It was so fast my brain could barely process it. It was now closer to the fence, and it was no longer trying to hide. It stepped out from behind the second tree and just stood there in the open, looking right at me. It was huge, 7 feet tall, easy. Its arms were long, hanging past its knees. The bow-legged stance I'd seen years before was clear now. It was built solid, powerful. I couldn't see its face clearly. It was too dark, but I got the impression of a heavy brow, and I just knew, its eyes were fixed on me. My paralysis broke. A jolt of pure animal terror shot through me, and I stumbled backward. My shoulder hit the doorframe, and the pain was sharp and real, snapping me the rest of the way into action. I scrambled inside, my heart trying to beat its way out of my chest. I slammed the door shut and fumbled with the deadbolt, my hands shaking so bad I could barely turn the knob. Click. I stood there panting, my back pressed against the cool wood of the door. I didn't move for what felt like an hour. I just listened. I expected to hear something, a thud against the door, a scratch at the window. But there was nothing, just silence, an unnatural, heavy, Silence. The crickets had stopped. Everything had stopped. I finally forced myself to peek through the blinds of the kitchen window that looked out onto the backyard. The yard was empty, the moonlit grass, the silent trees. Nothing. It was gone. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed, every creak of the house making me jump, my ears straining for any sound from outside. For nights after that, sleep was a battle. I'd jolt awake from dreams of that smooth leaping motion, of those long arms and that silent watching presence. That was the big one, the encounter that changed everything for me, but it wasn't the end. This thing, this entity, whatever it is, never fully left. There have been smaller incidents since then, things that shake me up but don't leave proof, like the banging. It started a few years after the big sighting. I'd be in bed, almost asleep, and then bang. A single massive impact against the side of the house. My house is brick, and the sound is like someone took a sledgehammer and hit the wall as hard as they could. The whole house shudders. I've shot out of bed, my heart instantly racing, and run to turn on all the lights. I'd go outside with a flashlight, always during the day, never at night, and check the wall. Nothing. No marks, no dents, no footprints in the flower beds below the windows. Just smooth, unbroken brick. It's happened maybe half a dozen times over the years, always late at night, always just one loud bang that vanishes without a trace. My sister has heard things too. My dad, before he passed, would just shake his head and say the woods were old. He never dismissed our fears, but he never had an explanation either. This thing has been around our neighborhood for decades. I'm an adult now, but that instinctual fear is still there, deep in my bones. I don't go outside alone at night, not to take out the trash, not to check the mail, nothing. If I have to, I'm hyper-aware of every shadow, every sound. My body is tense, ready to run. It's a reflex I can't turn off. I don't know what it is. I don't call it Bigfoot or Sasquatch. Those names feel like something from a TV show. To me, it's just the thing. A presence. A part of this land that doesn't like to be seen, but doesn't mind letting you know it's there. It's never tried to break in. It's never hurt anyone, but the feeling it leaves behind is a kind of violation. It's the knowledge that you're not always at the top of the food chain in your own backyard. That there's something out there that is stronger, faster, and completely at home in the dark, and it's been watching you your whole life. And sometimes, on the quietest, darkest nights, I lie in bed and I listen, and I wonder if it's listening back. Story 16. It was one of those hot summer afternoons where the air felt thick enough to drink. The year was 1957, and I was 6 years old. We lived in Valentine, Nebraska, a small town where everyone knew each other and nothing much ever happened. That's what made it so ordinary, right up until the moment it wasn't. My friend, a girl from a few houses down, and I were playing hide and seek. I can't tell you her name, not because I don't remember, but because even now, all these years later, it feels wrong to drag her into this. It was her turn to hide, and I was counting, my face pressed against the rough, warm wood of our backyard fence. I remember the smell of sun-baked dirt and cut grass. I remember the sound of locusts buzzing in the trees, a sound that usually meant summer and freedom. I got to 10, yelled, "Ready or not, here I come," and took off. I found her pretty quick, crouched behind our trash cans, and she laughed a little out of breath. We decided to expand our territory to make it more interesting. Our street was quiet, but behind the houses, running parallel to it, was a back alley. It wasn't a scary place. Not then. It was just a dirt lane used for garbage collection, bordered on both sides by wooden fences and the backs of garages. We weren't supposed to go down there alone, but we were 6, and the rules felt flexible in the summer. We walked into the mouth of the alley. The ground was packed dirt, rutted with old tire tracks. Weeds grew tall along the fence lines, and you could see the backs of houses, their windows dark or shaded. It was quieter in the alley, the buzz of the locusts muffled. We were walking away from my house, deeper in, just talking about what game to play next, when I saw it. At the very far end of the alley, where it curved and disappeared behind the Johnsons' property, something was coming towards us. At first, my brain didn't know what to do with it. It was just a shape, a dark shape, but it was moving. It was far away, a couple 100 feet at least, but even from that distance I could tell it was wrong. It was too tall, way too tall. It was walking upright like a person, but its legs were thick and its arms were so long. They swung at its sides, but they hung down past its knees. The way it moved was steady, purposeful. It wasn't loping or running. It was just walking, coming right down the middle of the alley, straight for us. My friend saw it a second after I did. I heard her little gasp, a tiny intake of breath that seemed to suck all the sound out of the world. The locusts stopped. Everything stopped. We just stood there, frozen. It was like my feet had been nailed to the dirt. My heart was suddenly a frantic, pounding thing in my chest, beating so hard I could feel it in my throat. This wasn't a man in a big coat. This wasn't a bear. I'd seen bears in picture books. They didn't walk like that. This thing was built like a person, a massive, impossibly large person. But it was covered in hair, thick, shaggy, dark brown or black hair that seemed to swallow the light. The sun was behind us, so its front was in shadow, but I could see the hair ripple with its movement. And then it made a sound. It wasn't a growl. It wasn't a howl. It was a deep, harsh noise that came from its chest, a roar that was also a scream. It was guttural and raw, like rocks grinding together, but with this horrible, high-pitched edge to it that scraped right down my spine. It wasn't loud. Not like a lion at the zoo. It was lower, more focused, and it carried down the alley and wrapped around us. It was the most inhuman sound I have ever heard, before or since. It wasn't meant to be heard by people. That sound broke the spell. The paralysis snapped. I don't know which of us moved first. There was no let's go or run. There was just a blind, panicked flight. We spun around so fast I almost fell, and then we were running. We ran like our lives depended on it, because in that moment, we truly believed they did. The fear was a physical thing, a cold fire in my veins. I didn't look back. I couldn't. Every nerve in my body was screaming at me to not look, to just run. I remember the feeling of my thin-soled sneakers slapping against the hard dirt, kicking up little puffs of dust. I remember my breath soaring in and out of my lungs, hot and ragged. I remember the stitch in my side, a sharp stabbing pain. But I didn't slow down. I could hear my friend right beside me, her breathing just as frantic. The only thing in my head was the image of that thing, its long arms, its steady walk, and the echo of that terrible tearing sound. We burst out of the alley and into the blinding brightness of the street. We didn't stop. We ran across the road, not even checking for cars, our legs pumping, arms pumping. We ran up my driveway, scrambled up the porch steps, and yanked the screen door open. It slammed shut behind us with a bang that made my mom jump. We collapsed on the linoleum floor of the kitchen, gasping for air. We were both crying, great, heaving sobs of pure terror. My mum was there in an instant, her face a mask of confusion and alarm. What in the world? What's wrong? What happened? I tried to tell her. I really did. The words tumbled out between gasps. In the alley, a monster, a big hairy monster. It was walking. It made a sound. I saw her face change. The alarm softened into a kind of patient concern. She knelt down, putting a hand on my forehead. Shh, shh. It's okay. You're safe now. You just got scared. Was it a big dog? Sometimes dogs can look scary. No! I insisted, my voice shrill. It wasn't a dog. It was walking. Like a person, it was so tall, and it roared. My friend was nodding, crying too, trying to back me up. It was real, she whispered. but my mum just smoothed my hair. "You two have been out in the sun too long. Your imaginations are running away with you. There's no such thing as monsters." That was the beginning of the real loneliness. The immediate heart-pounding terror of the alley began to fade, replaced by a different kind of chill, the feeling of not being believed. I told my dad when he got home from work. He listened, nodded and said, "Probably just a fella in a work coat, sweetheart. You know, from the farms." I told my older brother. He laughed and called me a scaredy cat. The neighborhood kids heard about it and teased us for a week. After a while, my friends stopped talking about it. When I brought it up, she'd get quiet and change the subject. It was like we had an unspoken agreement to let it go, but I couldn't let it go. The memory was burned into me. Lying in bed at night, with the window open, I'd listen to every night sound, the rustle of leaves, a distant dog barking, and my heart would start to race. Was that it? Was it out there? I'd pull the covers over my head and pray for morning. For years I carried it with me. It became my secret. This thing I knew was real, but that everyone else dismissed as a childhood fantasy. I didn't have a name for it. I didn't know what a Sasquatch was. To me, it was just the thing from the alley. The memory didn't feel like a dream. It felt more real than a lot of things that actually happened to me. I could still feel the grit of the alley dirt under my sneakers, the way the hot air had turned cold around us, the precise texture of that sound. Then, years later, I must have been in my early teens, I was at a neighborhood potluck. Mrs. Gable, my old second-grade teacher who lived on our street, was there. We got to talking, and for some reason, the conversation turned to strange noises you hear at night. I don't know what possessed me, but I mentioned that one time when I was really little, I'd heard something awful in the alley behind my house. She got very still. She looked at me, her eyes serious behind her glasses. "When was this?" she asked. "A long time ago," I said. "One summer. I was about 6. "What did it sound like?" Her voice was quiet. I tried to describe it. It was deep, but sharp too, like a roar and a scream mixed together. It was wrong. Mrs. Gable nodded slowly. She looked down at her plate, then back up at me. "I heard that too," she said. "It was the same summer. I was in my backyard, watering my roses in the late afternoon. I heard that god-awful sound come from the direction of the alley. It stopped me cold. I'd never heard anything like it. Not an animal, not a person. I remember thinking it sounded angry or in pain. I couldn't tell. I went inside and locked the door." She looked at me, and in her eyes, I didn't see the patient concern of my mother or the mocking disbelief of my brother. I saw recognition. I saw confirmation. She didn't say anything else about it. We just looked at each other for a long moment, and then the conversation moved on. But that was all I needed. That one moment of validation from a sensible, no-nonsense schoolteacher, a pillar of the community, was everything. It didn't make the memory less terrifying, but it made the weight of carrying it alone a little bit lighter. She heard it too. It was real. I'm an old woman now. I've lived a long life, seen a lot of things. But I've never seen that thing again. I've never heard that sound again. And I've never for a single second doubted what we saw that day in the alley. I didn't know what it was called then. And honestly, giving it a name now doesn't make it any less terrifying. It was a creature that didn't belong in my sunny, small-town world. It was a glimpse of something wild and ancient and utterly terrifying. Something that walked like a man, but wasn't a man. Something that looked at us from the end of that alley and let out a cry that was meant for a different world entirely. The terror of that moment, that panicked flight, never really left me. It left me with a belief in things that can't be explained, things that walk in the shadows just outside the edges of our safe, ordinary lives. I don't go down back alleys anymore, not even in the daytime. And sometimes on a quiet, hot summer afternoon, when the locusts start to buzz, I still get a chill. Story 17. Okay, so I've been sitting on this for a while and I don't really know where else to put it. I need to get it out there because it's been eating at me for months now, and I can't shake the feeling that something was watching us that day. Something huge and not human. I'm not some big conspiracy guy or anything. I've always been into the outdoors, camping since I was a kid, and I've heard the Bigfoot stories, but I never put much stock in them until this happened. My friends, they thought I was nuts for even suggesting we might see something. But hey, that's why we went out to the Upper Kawash River area in the Oregon Cascades east of Estacota. It's supposed to be one of those hotspots, you know. Remote, thick woods, not many people around. We picked a spot that felt way off the beaten path, down a dirt track that was barely drivable, and set up camp in this little clearing surrounded by tall firs and cedars. The air smelled like damp earth and pine, and the light was fading fast when we got there, casting long shadows that made everything feel kind of closed in. We were all in good spirits at first, joking around while we pitched the tents and got the fire going. I remember the sound of the river nearby, a constant rush that should have been soothing. But after a while it just made me feel isolated, like we were the only people for miles, and we probably were. My friends, let's call them Mark and Jake, though I won't use real names, they were skeptical from the start. Mark kept saying, "Dude, if we see Bigfoot, I'll eat my hat," and Jake just laughed it off. But I'd done my research. I knew this area had reports, so I was hopeful, maybe a little too eager. As it got darker, though, that eagerness started to twist into something else. The first thing that set me on edge was the wood knocks. It started maybe an hour after full dark, around when we were finishing up dinner. At first, it was just one knock, off in the distance, like someone hitting a tree with a thick branch. I perked up, thinking it might be an animal or something, but then another one answered from the opposite direction, then another and another. They weren't random. They sounded deliberate, like a conversation. Thump, pause, thump from the left, then a response from the right. The pauses got shorter, and the knocks got closer, slowly closing in on our camp. My friends noticed it too. Mark stopped talking mid-sentence, and we all just listened. The fire crackled, and the knocks kept coming, each one making my skin prickle. I felt this cold knot forming in my stomach, and I remember gripping my knees, my hands getting sweaty. We tried to brush it off, saying it was probably just trees falling or animals. But trees don't knock in patterns like that. It felt coordinated, like whatever was out there was surrounding us. The unease deepened with every minute. The knocks got louder, and I could hear them moving, like something big was shifting in the underbrush. The darkness beyond the firelight felt thick and heavy, and I kept staring into it, expecting to see eyes or movement. But there was nothing. Just blackness and those knocks. My heart was beating way too fast, and I had to force myself to breathe slowly. Mark suggested we turn on a flashlight and scan the trees, but when we did, the beams didn't reach far, and it just made the shadows dance in weird ways. That's when Jake said he wanted to check out the power lines nearby. There's a set of them running through the area, and he thought maybe we could get a better signal or something. Maybe even see if there was anyone else around. I think he was just looking for an excuse to get away from the knocks. I didn't want to go. Something in my gut told me to stay put, close to the fire. So they decided to head out together, leaving me alone at camp. I remember watching their flashlight beams disappear into the trees, and the second they were gone, the knocks stopped. Complete silence, except for the river and the fire. That was almost worse. I was alone for what felt like forever, but it was probably only 20 or 30 minutes. I kept the fire high, throwing on more wood every time it dipped because the light felt like my only protection. The air got colder, and I pulled my jacket tighter, shivering even though it wasn't that chilly. Then the other sounds started. First it was sticks snapping, not the little cracks you hear from squirrels or deer, but loud, sharp snaps like something heavy was stepping on them. They came from different directions, sometimes close, sometimes farther off, but always moving. Then I heard low grunts, deep and guttural like a pig or something, but way bigger. They were so low I felt them in my chest, more than heard them with my ears. Each grunt made the hair on my arms stand up, and I'd freeze, straining to hear more. My breathing got shallow, and I could feel my pulse thumping in my neck. I remember crouching by the fire, my back to it so I could face the darkness. And my legs were trembling so bad I had to sit down. I kept telling myself it was just a bear, but bears don't grunt like that, not in sequences that sound almost like speech. I threw another log on the fire, and the flames leaped up, casting flickering light that made the trees seem to sway. For a second, I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, a dark shape shifting between two firs. But when I turned, it was gone. My mind was racing, imagining all sorts of things, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The grunts got closer, and I could hear breathing now, heavy and rhythmic, like whatever it was just standing there, observing me. I didn't dare move, just sat there, clutching a stick like it was some kind of weapon, knowing full well it wouldn't do squat against something big. Time dragged on, and every sound made me jump. The pop of the fire, a rustle in the leaves, anything. I was so relieved when I finally heard Mark and Jake coming back, their voices cutting through the tension. When they returned, they looked spooked too. Jake was pale, and Mark was talking fast, saying they'd heard rock-knocking sounds near camp while they were out. Not wood knocks, but rocks being hit together, like someone was signaling. They said it came from the direction of our tents, and it stopped when they got closer. We all stood there by the fire listening, but everything had gone quiet again. The knocks, the grunts, all of it had stopped. We tried to rationalize it, saying maybe it was other campers or hikers messing with us, but we hadn't seen anyone else all day, and this area is so remote, it didn't make sense. The skepticism in my friends was gone. They were as freaked out as I was. We decided to stay up together, keeping the fire going, but the night wasn't over. Around 3:30 in the morning, the grunting started again, but this time it was different. It came from two sources, really close by, maybe 50 feet from the camp on either side. One was deeper, more resonant, and the other was slightly higher, like they were communicating. Huffing sounds mixed in, short exhales that sounded aggressive. I was sitting between Mark and Jake, and we all heard it. We didn't speak, just exchanged wide-eyed looks. My mouth went dry, and I could feel the cold seeping into my bones despite the fire. The sounds were so close I could almost pinpoint where they were coming from, but when we shined lights that way, we saw nothing, just dense undergrowth and shadows. The grunts would pause, then start up again, and I remember thinking, this is it. We're surrounded, and whatever it is, it's not afraid of us. We sat there, frozen, listening until the sky started to lighten with dawn. The sounds faded away as the sun rose like they'd never been there, but the fear lingered. As soon as it was fully light, we packed up in a hurry. No one said much, we just wanted to get out of there. The morning was misty and quiet, and the woods felt different, oppressive, like they were holding secrets. We loaded the car and started driving down Forest Road 43, the dirt road rough under the tires. I was in the passenger seat, staring out the window, still jittery. That's when it happened. We were rounding a bend, going slow because of the ruts, and something massive dashed across the road ahead of us. It was huge, like 9 feet tall, dark brown and covered in hair. It moved so fast, I barely got a good look, but I saw its shape. Broad shoulders, long arms, and it ran on 2 legs, crashing into the trees on the other side. It was gone in seconds. We all saw it. Mark slammed on the brakes, and we just sat there, stunned. The car idled, and for a moment, no one spoke. Then Jake whispered, "What the hell was that?" We got out, hearts pounding, and walked to where it crossed. The ground was soft with moss, and right there in the middle of the road was a footprint. A barefoot track, huge, about 18 inches long, with clear toes and a deep impression. It looked fresh, like it had just been made. We crouched down examining it, and I felt a mix of awe and terror. This was real. We fumbled for our phones to take pictures, and I remembered I had some plaster in the car for casting, but in our rush, we'd left it buried in the gear. By the time we dug it out, the track had started to blur in the damp moss, and we couldn't get a good cast. We tried, but it came out messy, and we ended up with nothing solid to show. I regret that so much now. If we'd been calmer, more prepared, we might have had proof. We drove back to town in silence, and I haven't been camping since. That series of encounters, from the knocks to seeing that thing, left me convinced Sasquatch is out there, and I came face to face with it, or close enough. I still get chills thinking about the grunts in the dark, how close they were, and that massive shape crossing the road. It's something I can't explain, and I don't think I ever will. Ciao. Story 18. Okay, so I've been sitting on this for decades, and I guess now's as good a time as any to get it out. I'm still not sure what to make of it all, and even now, typing this, my hands are a little shaky. Back in the late 70s, me and my buddy Corey Rudolph got it into our heads that we needed to get out of Los Angeles. The city was just too much. Noise, traffic, people everywhere, and we were both into weird stuff, you know? Folklore, cryptids, all that. We'd heard these whispers about Bigfoot sightings out near Palmdale, close to Edwards Air Force Base, and we figured, why not? We packed up his beat-up truck one day in 1977 and just started driving north into the desert. We weren't experts or anything, just two guys curious about what might be out there. This one day, I remember it like it was yesterday. It was a Tuesday, I think, sometime in the fall of 1979. We'd been at this for a couple of years by then, talking to locals, hiking around, trying to find any clue about these desert Sasquatches people claimed to see. The air was dry and hot, even though it was getting toward evening, and the sun was starting to dip behind the mountains, casting long shadows that made everything look kind of eerie. Corey was driving, and I was in the passenger seat, staring out at the scrubland and Joshua trees whipping by. We were headed to meet this lieutenant from the base who'd agreed to talk to us off the record. We'd managed to get a tip from a guy in a bar in Palmdale who said the military knew more than they let on. We pulled up to this diner just outside the base perimeter. It was one of those places that looked like it had been there forever, with cracked vinyl seats and the smell of old coffee and grease hanging in the air. The lieutenant was already there, sitting in a booth in the back. He was a young guy, maybe in his late 20s, but he had this tired look in his eyes, like he'd seen things he couldn't unsee. He didn't give us his name, just said to call him Lieutenant. We ordered coffee, and he started talking, his voice low, almost a whisper, like he was afraid someone might overhear. He told us about this one night a few months back. He was on duty with a couple other guys, doing a perimeter check with a starlight scope. That's one of those night vision devices the military uses. It was pitch black out there, no moon, just stars, and the desert was dead quiet. Through the scope, he saw something moving way out in the distance. At first he thought it was a bear or something, but as it got closer he realized it was way too big and walked on two legs. He described it as tall, covered in dark hair, with these long arms that swung as it moved. It was just wandering, like it was browsing or something, not in a hurry. Then out of nowhere, a helicopter came buzzing overhead, probably one of theirs from the base. The moment the sound hit, this thing froze, then took off running. And I mean running fast like a deer, but smoother, more powerful. It vanished into the darkness in seconds, leaving nothing behind. The lieutenant said he and his men just stood there, stunned. None of them spoke for a good minute afterward. He said it was the most unreal thing he'd ever witnessed. And he'd been in the service for years. Hearing him say that, I felt this cold knot form in my stomach. Corey and I exchanged looks, and I could see he was just as freaked out as I was. The lieutenant went on, telling us that this wasn't a one-time thing. He said they'd had other sightings, even on the base itself. He mentioned talking to a major and some grunt who'd seen similar creatures near the underground tunnels. They had videos, he said, but they were classified, locked away where no one could see them. The weird part was, he thought these things felt protected on the base, like they knew they were safe there. And no, he didn't think it had anything to do with UFOs or aliens, just these big, hairy apes that nobody could explain. By the time we left the diner, the sun was almost down, and the desert was getting cold fast. The air had that crisp, clean smell you only get out there, but now it felt heavy, like something was watching us. We got back in the truck, and Corey started driving toward this spot we'd heard about from other witnesses, a dry riverbed north of the base, where people claimed to have seen activity. Neither of us said much at first. We were both processing what we'd heard. I kept picturing that thing running, the way the lieutenant described it, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. The dashboard lights cast a faint glow, and I could see Corey's hands tight on the wheel. We parked the truck off a dirt road, about a mile from where we wanted to hike. The sky was full of stars by then, no city lights to drown them out, and it was so quiet you could hear your own heartbeat. We grabbed our gear, flashlights, a camera, some recording equipment, and started walking. The ground was rocky and uneven, and every step crunched under our boots. The air was cool now, and I zipped up my jacket, feeling the chill seep in. We'd been out there before, but tonight felt different. After what the lieutenant said, every shadow seemed to move. Every rustle in the brush made me jump. We reached the riverbed after about 20 minutes of walking. It was wide and sandy, with clumps of brush here and there. We decided to set up near a large rock formation where we could get a good view. Corey switched on his flashlight, sweeping it across the area, but everything was still. I remember the smell out there, dry dust, sagebrush, and something else. Something musky like wet dog or old fur. I mentioned it to Corey, and he nodded, saying he smelled it too. We both knew that smell from other accounts. People often reported it before seeing something. We sat there for what felt like hours, just listening and watching. The stars moved slowly overhead, and the wind picked up, whistling through the rocks. My legs were getting stiff from sitting, and I was starting to think we'd wasted our time. Then out of nowhere we heard it, a deep guttural sound, like a growl, but more vocal, coming from somewhere to our left. It wasn't loud, but it carried through the silence, and it froze us both in place. I felt my heart hammering in my chest, and I could see Corey's eyes wide in the dim light. He slowly pointed his flashlight in the direction of the sound, but there was nothing there. We waited, barely breathing, and then we heard footsteps, not like a person's, heavier with a kind of thud that vibrated through the ground. They were moving slowly, crunching on the gravel and getting closer. I grabbed Corey's arm and he shushed me, his hand shaking as he held the light. The smell got stronger, that musky odor now mixed with something rotten, like decay. It made my stomach turn. We were both crouched low behind the rock, peeking over the edge. The footsteps stopped, and for a second, everything was silent again. Then, maybe 50 yards away, something moved. It was tall, way taller than a man, and dark against the starry sky. It was just standing there, silhouetted, and I could see it was broad-shouldered, with arms that hung down almost to its knees. I don't know how long we stared, but it felt like forever. My mouth was dry, and I could feel sweat trickling down my back despite the cold. Corey had the camera up, but he didn't take any pictures. Later, he said he was too scared to move. Then, the thing turned its head, and I swear it looked right at us. I couldn't see its eyes, but I felt this intense pressure, like it was sizing us up. My breath caught in my throat, and I thought I was going to pass out. Suddenly it took a step forward, and that's when we heard a distant hum, probably a plane or something from the base. The moment the sound reached us, the creature froze, just like the lieutenant described. Then, in a flash, it spun around and bolted. It didn't run like a human. It was fluid, powerful, eating up the ground in huge strides. Within seconds it was gone, vanished into the darkness like it had never been there. We stayed behind that rock for what felt like an hour, too terrified to move. The smell lingered, and the only sound was the wind and our ragged breathing. When we finally gathered the courage to stand up, my legs were like jelly. We packed our gear as fast as we could and practically ran back to the truck. The whole drive back to our motel, neither of us spoke. I kept glancing out the window, half expecting to see that thing following us. But there was nothing. When we got inside, we just sat on the beds, staring at the wall. Corey finally broke the silence, saying, "What the hell was that?" I didn't have an answer. We'd spent years chasing stories, but this was different, this was real, and it scared the shit out of us. The lieutenant's words echoed in my head about how these things are still out there, monitored by the military, and how maybe even other beings are interested in them. To this day, I don't know what we saw that night. Was it a Bigfoot, some kind of desert ape? I have no idea. But I do know that whatever it was, it's still out there. And sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark, I can still smell that musky odor and feel those eyes on me. I never went back to that spot, and Corey and I don't talk about it much. It's just one of those things that happened, and I guess it'll always be a mystery.